Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. To those of you in the room and everyone who's joining online, it's a pleasure to be having another of our Great Minds events where we're trying to give something back to the people that continue to support dementia research by giving us their time, taking part in our studies. And as you know, in these events, we try and cover the latest developments that are in the dementia space, and each event is themed around a particular development. And today we're going to be talking about blood biomarkers and the way that data science is advancing dementia research. The program would be that we're going to hear talks from the director of Dementias Platform UK, John Gallacher, who is going to be talking about the big data and what that has told us. And then it will be the leadership of the readout study that will be talking about its various implications. And with that, I'll hand over to Vanessa, who leads readout, to tell us about it briefly, and then we'll move on to John.
Thanks very much, Ivan. I'm going to move over because if not, I'm blocked by the screen. So just so you can all see me. And welcome particularly because, as Ivan said, I know that a lot of these Great Minds events have been running quite a lot over the last few years. And I think I came to one 2 or 3 years ago. But really, really good to be able to welcome, hopefully, some participants for our readout study today, whether in person or online. And I guess just to reinforce that, I think we've got a great lineup of discussions today and talks. It's a very exciting time, I think, in terms of changes around diagnosis of diseases that can cause dementia. But we're also going to reflect a little bit on how easy it could be to implement some of this in the real world, because obviously there's always a lot of interesting research going on, but how easily can we actually get it into practice and into the real world so it benefits people, benefits patients, benefits the public. But without further ado, I'm going to hand over to John Gallacher.
I'm going to talk about big data. So welcome to DPUK. DPUK is actually quite large and developing. If that's, I'm going to talk about the data on the blue on the left, and others this afternoon will talk about the trial delivery and experimental medicine in the context of Great Minds. Some people think it's a bit of a monster. I think it's a bit of Gaudi architecture. Myself, I don't know whether you've ever been to Barcelona, the Sagrada Familia Basilica. It's the largest unfinished Roman Catholic church in the world, okay? And it's a very apt comparison because in terms of big data and our experimental and trials programs, DPUK is developing all the time. It is growing, and currently we have submitted a renewal with MRC, and we await their response. Personally, I'm very excited about it. I think we're offering some really, really good stuff. But I'm going to talk about the data portal this afternoon. The thing about big data is precision, okay? Precision. So this is an example of precision. These data come from UK Biobank, and a large number of people into 5 figures were asked to wear an accelerometer on their wrist, and some of you in the room may have worn this. And they wore it they got it posted to them. They wore it for 7 days, and they sent it back. And this was to record their normal levels of physical activity. I went to a reception at the Houses of Parliament, and one of our hosts, one of the member of the House of Lords, was saying how they had been sent an accelerometer, and they were so pleased with it, they waved it about all day to make sure it worked. And all the scientists in the room went, "Oh no." But I think we hid it as best we could, but there we go. What is interesting about this is what it shows, all right? And what it shows is the energy levels for different age groups throughout the day. Now, if you'd been asking this question using a questionnaire, it would have just been one curve, okay? Because you're measuring it with precision, you get much, much better definition. So which group are you in? Are you under 54? Because that's the top level. And that shows you after the dip at lunchtime, you perk up again with all those extra calories, and then it slowly tails off towards the afternoon. Or are you 55 to 64? Not much of a recovery in the afternoon. Are you actually at the 75 to 79 years? Well, you peak a bit earlier and you do not recover. Okay. The afternoons are tough going. I'm with you. I'm on your side. And it's the same for men and for women. So we get precision. Now, we also get precision through size. So let's just look at a heart disease example because it's a really, really good example. This is heart disease mortality and blood pressure in 5,000 people. So 5,000 is quite a large number, wouldn't you agree? Quite a large number, 5,000 people. And if you're looking at how the risk of heart disease changes in different age groups, it's like a mess of knitting, all right? Who knows what's going on there? If we then did it in 50,000 adults, you'd see, oh, there's a relationship there, but it doesn't seem to be linear. It seems to be curvilinear. There's a bit of a J-shaped curve in the younger age group. If you do it in 500,000 adults, it's a log linear straight line. You know the answer. It's simple. Okay? Now, you only know the answer to that question because not everything is simple, but the point is you get precision. And that means you can move on to the next question. So, and the beauty of this is the 50,000 are a random sample of 500,000. The 5,000 are a random sample of the 500,000. There is no selection bias here. This is a really strong experiment. So let's talk about what has big data told us about dementia. Well, first of all, it's told us that it's complicated. And it really is. Okay. And I'm going to manage your expectations by talking about the complications first. All right, so we're going to look at what are the 5 V's: the volume of data, the velocity or the speed of data, the variety, the different types of data, the if you like, the veracity, do we really believe these data? And then the scientific value. Okay, volume. This is a graph of dementia publications over the last, well, I don't know, 50 years. You can see they've gone up exponentially. And then if you look at cohorts in trials, particularly, they've gone up exponentially. And this means that there's so much data around. And the question is not how much data is there, but how do we organize it so that we can make sense of it? So that we can actually go to these graphs and say, heart disease, blood pressure, yeah, lifestyle, dementia, lifestyle, cognitive decline. All right. So that's the big challenge. And just as an aside, it's not an equal challenge. If we look at the different levels of different amounts of data, different volume of data in different parts of the world, you'll see that in Europe, 6% of the population on average are involved in dementia research. Okay. You go to Africa, 0.1%. So there is basically a global inequality here, which is quite important because it's you're being very risky if you take results basically discovered in a Northwestern European population. Oh, this must be true elsewhere. This must be true in Asia. It must be true in Africa. No way must it be true. But nevertheless, it's good to start somewhere. And I think here in Europe, we are in a very privileged position in terms of big data. So let's look at velocity. So over the last, I don't know, 50 years or so, the size of studies has increased. So when I'm giving myself away here, when I was beginning in my career, Framingham was a big study. Here we had, if you had access to Framingham data, you could do so much. And then there was Richard Doll's smoker study, 50,000. Oh, that was unheard of. That was groundbreaking. 50,000 doctors you recruited to a single study. Then along came UK Biobank, 500,000. And now we have Our Future Health, 5 million. And the UK is globally leading in terms of these large studies. But the challenge of these large studies is the amount of data you're getting in per unit time increases. And therefore, you have to manage it. And you manage it differently. It takes all different sorts of infrastructures to manage it. But nevertheless, that's one of the challenges. And I think the UK is doing really well in that regard. Okay, let's look at the variety of data. Well, again, when I was cutting my epidemiologic teeth, we did surveys. And I'm very proud of our questionnaires we were too. And now we do, if you like, genetic studies, which look at particular genes. And then we look at brain imaging. That's a bit more complicated because you've got so much information coming out of a single brain image. And then we go back to genes, do gene sequencing so that every different little part of your genome is annotated and put on record. And then we have to put all of these things together in terms of multimodal analyses. And then what we would really like to do, though we haven't quite managed it yet, very few people have managed it, is link all of this to electronic health records. All right? Each of these has their own complexity. Each of these types of data has their own little idiosyncrasies. And if you're going to produce good science, which is what we're about, you have to understand that and work out what's the best way to put the data together. Do you understand the data? So our study I was involved in, it was a very old study, obviously, and the missing value was 999. Okay, so if you had a value of 2, 3, 4, 5, 25, if it was missing, 9 would go in instead, or 99 or 999. Okay, then if you have people who don't understand the data, they analyze it, they go, we've got this fantastic frequency of people with high values. This changes everything. Well, it doesn't, of course. They just didn't understand the data set. But of course, if nobody picks this up, it goes into the publication, into the folklore of big data. So you've got to be really careful in understanding these different data sets. And then there is, do you actually trust the data you've got? Really interesting question. So what happens is, I do a survey, I get my data, I then provide it to a data platform like DPUK. DPUK then structures it, etc., and makes it available to third-party researchers. Third-party researchers get to play with it, come up with their results, and you think, oh, hang on, does this really work? And the only way around that is to have a platform where the trust or the provenance of the data is built into the system. So you can have a full audit trail going back from the results to the analysis, to the rationale, to the pre-processing, to the data uploading, back to the original survey of the original study which produced the data. And at DPUK, we've worked really hard to have what we would describe as trust by design architecture. There's a full end-to-end audit trail for all of our data. Okay, and that means if you don't believe something, there's this anomalous result with 999 in it, all these facts, you can trace it back, work through, somebody didn't understand the data, which is great because you can then correct it. But if you don't have this end-to-end audit trail, there is always the risk that some mistake has slipped in quite genuinely, but it's not detected and it's not detectable by going backwards because there is no backwards trail. Okay, so we work very hard to have what we describe as trust by design architecture. And another reason why this is critical is that research is based on trust, on public trust. And if you as a public, if you as donors, if you as participants aren't trusting what we do, then you'll just walk out the door. Okay, and that would be an enormous tragedy. So trust by design, we work very hard for this end to end, and that will go through it briefly. We have this data ingestion. We then curate it to research readiness so that there's a standard data set for people to access. This can work. This is interoperable with other data platforms. We can discover these data. We then broker the access, so it makes it much quicker, and I'll go into this later. We provide secure data analysis facilities so that you know exactly what the data do not leave our portal. Okay, you can be confident that we haven't stuck it on a data pen, given it to somebody else in good faith, but nevertheless you don't know what's happening after that. We know exactly what happens. Technically, we could audit every keystroke, but life's a bit too short for that. Okay, but nevertheless we know exactly what happens, and then we work out who does what, what's valuable, etc., and improve it. So trust by design architecture. Then we come on to value. Value is very hard to measure. Okay, what might be a nondescript finding one year might turn out to be groundbreaking the next year. So it's very hard to measure. But in terms of use, I think we've got a really good case. So our data portal has received over the last 5 to 10 years, let me think, if you look on the left there, 2,505 access requests. That's not bad, really. These come from trying to access over 100 data sets. We have over 1,200 users in 43 countries around the world. I'm not aware that any other research cohort database has that level of usage. And because we use standard procedures, we turn around requests within 20 days. And that is, go and speak to anybody else who's applied for data access, and 3 months later, 6 months later, they're still trying to work out whether they got permission or not. We can turn it around in 20 days. But it's because we've worked very hard to have this system which is fully auditable, but also very efficient. Okay, so much for the complexity. Let's look at some of the results. All right. If you were asked to go into a brain scanner and have radioactive material injected into your veins to travel through your brain, are you up for that? Okay, well, lovely, lovely. If you knew that by doing that, you would be able to have better prediction of your risk of dementia, would you be up for that? Yeah. No.
What the thing is, I know my wife had one, but they've just confirmed exactly what her dementia was.
Right, okay. If you knew there was a drug targeting that particular sort of dementia, okay, would you have it? Would you have the brain scan? I would. You know, so no brainer, right? It's absolutely I would. But you need studies like this to show that, and you need studies like this to show this at scale. So here we have comparing if you like, a brain scan which is detecting amyloid protein in your brain, obviously, it's a brain scan. And this is showing, does it improve prediction? And does it improve prediction more if you have a continual high, medium, low level of amyloid, or whether you just say high or none? Okay? And what we see is that the amyloid does improve the prediction. Now, if you've got a whole load of cognitive tests leading up for the last 10 years, it doesn't improve it much because the cognitive tests actually are very, very informative. But not many people have that. It's the truth of the matter. In fact, one person in this room might have that. Okay. If you haven't got a whole load of cognitive tests, to have the amyloid scan improves, which is the red dots here, improves the prediction substantially. Okay. This required hundreds of people to get this level of precision. All right, let's go on to another one. Metabolic syndrome and dementia. Well, if you think of metabolic syndrome as being, if you like, the precursor to diabetes, and it's related to obesity, high blood pressure, high glucose, and an unusual lipid profile, do these things predict dementia? And the reason why this is important is because if you do have any of these risk factors, these are things that can be changed, either through lifestyle or drug intervention. Okay. And I think the two interesting bits are the bottom two. All right. And what this is showing you is that having metabolic syndrome increases your risk of dementia, not just you're predicting at the time, which is the second row, but actually predicts it over 5 years and predicts it more than 10 years in advance. Now, I don't think I have metabolic syndrome, okay? My clinical friends can correct me afterwards if they think this is slightly unfortunate. But if I did, I would do something about it because this predicts my risk over 5, 10, 15 years in advance. Again, this required about 300,000 people to get that level of precision. Okay, sedentary activity and dementia risk. Well, they do say that you should be physically active, and far be it from me to, and I'll come on to that shortly. But what about sedentary activity? Just keeping the mind active or just not doing anything? Is this related to dementia? Well, this is a really interesting question. So let's take sleep, top left. You can have too much and too little. So it's worth monitoring your sleep. And it's worth thinking, okay, if I have too much, what's really going on here? And if I'm in bed 9, 10 hours a day, what's going on? Or if I can't sleep at all, if I only get 3 hours sleep a night, what's really happening? What are the triggers? What are the causes? And then seeing if you can do something about that. And a large proportion of the people in this room will have a difficulty staying asleep the whole night. Okay? And it's not that they wake up and go back to sleep, it's that they wake up and they don't go back to sleep. So it's just worth thinking about what are those triggers. Okay, I'm going to go on to TV viewing, bottom middle. If you just sit there and just watch the TV, related strongly to your risk of dementia. But the question is, why? Is it because you're watching TV? Or is it because actually your dementia is catching up with you? I think it's a really interesting question. I tend to think it might be the latter, if I'm honest with you. So if you just sit there and stare at the screen all night, it's probably not causal, but it's probably not helpful either. Right, and it's just worth taking some notice of it. Now I think this is really interesting. So this study was required about 700,000 people to do. And it shows you the relationship between people who read in terms of their risk of dementia. We'll use that as the reference point, any reading, the dotted line running horizontally, and the risk of dementia for people who don't read. Here's the funny thing. Within 3 years, there's a very strong risk association between dementia and whether you read or not. If you go on to about 7 years, the risk is reduced. If you go down to about 12 years, the risk is minimal. Now, is this due to not reading improving your risk of dementia? No. Or is it due to the fact that people who already have some dementia don't read? Okay? And this is called reverse causation. And this is one of the complications of looking at big data. What is causing which? And it really is complicated. Now, on the other, this is a unique study. This is the Million Women study. This is a unique study. It's brilliant at showing reverse causation. Absolutely brilliant. This does not mean that doing your exercises, brain training, and living a good lifestyle, etc., is not doing you any good. It is. What it's showing you is a lot of people don't do it. And therefore, at a population level, the benefit is not shown. Okay? I love this bit. This is my study, by the way. No. This is the relationship between adiposity and your risk of dementia. Okay? Sorry, adiposity and where you live. The risk of dementia we already discussed. And what it shows, and again, about 500,000 people this required, what it shows is that with a residential density of about 1,800, which is the vertical line A, people who live within that level of residential density are least fat. Isn't that strange? Sorry, most fat, most fat. But once you go beyond that, the more dense the population, the more lean you become. Why? But you never expected that. I didn't. No. It's interesting, isn't it? Any other offers?
Are these people of all ages?
Well, we could look at that, couldn't we? We could look at different age groups. Top left, same graph. Male and female, roughly the same graph. Employed, retired, unemployed, i.e. level of occupationally related activity, same graph. Physical activity, going out to do exercise, same graph. What do you think's going on? Well, it is. They're all in the UK, but it's something more than that. Sorry? Yes.
Using a car when you live in the country.
Exactly. There was one more. Pollution. I don't think it's pollution. I really do think that when you go to high density environments, you tend to walk more. Isn't that interesting? You know, so it's very hard to think this is reverse causation. It might be a bit, but I don't think it's the whole explanation, if I'm honest with you. Okay. So that means in high density areas, and I can think of a fantastic, very high density area called Hong Kong, people walk a lot. And if you were therefore designing a city which would affect multiple generations, so it would have a small effect on millions of people across generations, how would you do it? No, yeah. But the point is.
John, sorry, if there's a comment from the floor, can you repeat it? Because people online can't hear the comments from the floor.
Oh, that's complicated. I'll do my best. Okay. No more comments from the floor. Is that okay? Okay. The point is, we now have the science through big data which can genuinely address these questions. And 20 years ago, we couldn't. So you can now work out how to design dementia-friendly cities. Singapore is well designed. That was a comment from the floor. Singapore is well designed. Yeah. It's also very affluent. They have the ability to design. But nevertheless, what I'm establishing is the scientific principle. This is what we can do with big data. Okay. So what is the future for big data? Well, I think what would be transformative is linking molecular data to health data. That would increase the value of our data platform tenfold, 20-fold. Because when we have all of these data, what you really want to do is link them to long-term health outcomes. And through the NHS number, you can do it. It's not a technical problem. It's only a governance problem. And a governance problem boils down to what value do the public see in allowing people to look at their personal health records? And what safeguards are there to protect personal identity? And we have built systems which do that. We have the technology, we really do. We just don't yet have the permissions. But if you can do that, you're going from molecular, cellular research data, all your genetics. You can then go through your environment, see what the outcomes are, build your healthy cities, okay? And we can do this through our governance neutral pop-up system. The future is federation. One of the things we want to do in our renewal is relate UK data to German data, to Norwegian data, to Chinese data, to Australian data. Because if we can do that, we get a much, much bigger picture of what's going on. And the reason why I've got these complicated diagrams here is on the left, you need to have a system where anybody can interrogate anybody else's data. Okay, otherwise governments won't accept it. And I think fair enough. Okay, but to do that, you have this complicated submission layer, federated analysis maps. And the map there is not for you to understand, it's for you to say it's complicated. Okay, complicated. But the future is federation. The future is integrating specialist data platform. So you might have an imaging community, you might have a genetics community, you might have a community relating to traumatic brain injury, a community relating to Parkinson's disease, but you want to bring them all together so they can share their data to get the greatest scientific benefit from that. And that's one of the things that we are doing as Dementia Platform UK. In our next iteration, we have all of these things are things that we will be doing, we are either are doing or we will be doing, and therefore it's an exceptionally cost-effective way of extracting maximum scientific value from all the data that people like you have provided. And the future is multi-purpose data platforms. Having built something for dementia, you can then lift it up, change the color palette, put it down again, and then repurpose it. In this case, for adolescent mental health. And one of the things we've done is taken all the scale that we've developed and all the technology we've developed for Dementia's platform and applied it to adolescent mental health. And in 7 weeks, we recruited 15,000 young people. And in next November, we will recruit a further 10,000 young people. And that's all because of the work that people like you have put into enabling us to study dementia at scale. So I think I'd just like to thank you for that and appreciate that it has more value than you think. Lastly, we make the data freely available, okay? What we want is the people with the best ideas to access the best data to get the best results. And that really is what Dementia's platform is all about. Thank you very much.
Maybe I'll start off with one already posted online, which is, what do you think are the most pressing current challenges of multimodal data integration, and how can we respond to them?
The most pressing challenges of multimodal data integration, I think it's really quite simple, actually, pre-processing. If you are a geneticist and you want to relate your genes to the imaging data, there is no way you're going to spend 3 years becoming a fully qualified brain imager. All right, you need to say, okay, just give me the brain volume. Okay, just give me the hippocampal volume. Just give me the amyloid load. But in order to do that, you have to have standard, fully auditable procedures so that who is an imager can then go back and check that he's done it the right way. So pre-processing to make sure that the data are high quality and accessible by more than just the single discipline specialist. To me, that transforms everything.
If local memory clinics are the centre of excellence in a locality for people such as myself who have got an AD diagnosis, what confidence would you have that they have got the technical ability to make full use of the information which you have got and will be transferring to them? Will they know what to ask for? Who is going to be the conduit between the data platform and the local memory clinic?
Yeah, this is a really good question, but a very hard question to answer, because usually there is a bit of a administrative gulf between service providers and researchers. And one of the things that DPUK has worked hard at, particularly Ivan and Vanessa, is trying to bridge this gulf. Now, but it's a two-way thing. You know, we can't walk up to a memory clinic and say, oh, have our data, all right? And they can't walk up to us and say, give us all your data. It's a bit more, life's not that simple. But what we can do is work together so that we can have procedures and pipelines in place to collect data in the memory clinic, translate it or to the data platform, use it for analyses, etc., and use those analyses to improve the precision of the diagnosis and the prognosis, and hopefully potentially targeting treatments within the memory clinic. But it is a process.
Thank you. Sorry, one question online, and there's a lady over there we'll come to next. John, you're talking about dementia, but there are at least 100 different types of dementia. Are you talking principally about Alzheimer's?
Oh, wow, that's a tough one. I'm earning my money today, aren't I, really? Science is a progression of knowledge. Okay. 100 years ago, dementia from Mr. Alzheimer. 50 years ago, vascular dementia, then Parkinson's disease. And what you find that is that if you look at clinical definitions, they are always by definition imprecise. They're just the best we can do at the moment. But if you look at biological definitions, they refer to specific pathways. And I expect strongly that there's not going to be one sort of Alzheimer's disease. There's going to be multiple different pathways, and different drugs will be more effective on different pathways. So the idea of increasing your precision of diagnosis means you're also increasing the development of targeted drugs which will be effective for you, rather than we'll give it a go and see if it works. And I think we're not there yet, but that's where we're going to. So you might, I had a bowel cancer about 5 years ago. Not very pleasant, I have to tell you. But I had this test to see which drug would work for me, would be most likely to work for me. Okay? So, John, do you want to take this test? Yes, I do. Really simple. Okay? And as we have more precise treatments, so we will want more precise diagnosis to say, yes, this is the best drug for you. And even though the symptoms might be very similar to somebody else, because there's a different pathway involved, that is the best drug for the other person.
In the data that you showed us, that we saw that the cities, need to be denser when they're planning them, or that's the ideal. But yet, when we looked at who was asking for the data, government came down really, really low. And I just wondered, how you can influence the government to actually use these data more frequently.
Oh, so going from evidence to policy is a big jump. No, it's a great question. They're wonderful questions. But going from evidence to policy is a big jump, because you might say, I want this city designed to minimize obesity. Okay. But actually, it might involve increasing complexity. And it might be that from a dementia point of view, you want simplicity. So you want fewer curves, fewer junctions, so that in your short-term memory, you don't have to remember so much. Here I turn right, as opposed to, oh, this is a bit of a curve. Is this where I turn right or not? Okay. So what you end up is with a compromise. And that's where it's difficult translating evidence into policy, because it is the democratically elected politician who ultimately decides what the compromise will be. It's very hard.
For the party conferences recently, I've been asked to get my MP to attend presentations from Alzheimer's Society or other groups, which will, I hope, benefit the research in the long run.
Yeah. So I think the real issue there is having the discussion, so that Alzheimer's disease or dementia is not an orphan subject or a taboo subject. What we really want to do is to bring the debate to the forefront of the political agenda, because only by doing that will we achieve consensus about which are the compromises that we think are best for society as a whole. And I think that is really important. But you won't, if you like, achieve the consensus at the conference, but you will achieve raising the profile.
We can ask our MP why they didn't attend the desk.
Absolutely. Far be it from me to offer a directive comment, but
We'll just take one more question, and we'll save the other questions for the end. I've got a specific one on something you raised, John, regarding the scientific data on reading. So sorry, what are the specifics of reading that's important? What types of reading were measured? Is it the relaxing element of reading, i.e. fiction, key, or learning element studying?
Okay, so this was any reading, and I think the point of this slide was to suggest to you that it was not that the reading itself was having an effect Okay, but the lack of reading was reflecting an ongoing effect. Now, but then I said, if I remember correctly, that this shows you that few people are actually doing sufficient to engage their brain. And therefore, you're not seeing that in these big data. All right. So if I was offering retirement advice, and normally this comes at about £5,000 an hour, okay, I would say what you should do is have some physical activity, okay, some social activity, and some cognitive activity, some intellectual activity. All right. And by and large, having those three things in your daily routine will give you a better quality of life, is likely to reduce your risk of heart attack, and is likely to reduce your risk of dementia. Okay, particularly vascular dementia. So there we are. It's free.
Thank you very much, John. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Given that we're a bit ahead of time, we thought we would run through the next talk, which is logically related to this, which is the one on AI, and then we'll break for teas, which will be in the room next door, and we'll allow those online to get the kettles going, and then we'll come back for the blood biomarker talks. We thought we would do a talk like this to thematically link to what John was talking about, because clearly artificial intelligence is the driving force behind a lot of the innovation nowadays, certainly in the medical field, but you can hear it in all aspects of life. So the question that I thought we'd address here is what is the impact specifically for dementia? And the first question to answer is, what is artificial intelligence, so that we're all on the same page. This is a broad term that puts together all activities that see a computer try and emulate, try and replicate humans in doing intelligent tasks. And a specific, the most popular type of artificial intelligence is machine learning, which is essentially where computer systems learn from data. Okay, and the usual output is that they're able, through this learning from data, to detect hidden patterns, ones that it would either take us a lot of time to uncover if we were just examining them as researchers sitting in a room, or it would take much larger data sets for us to be able to uncover these same patterns. And there's three key forms, and they have slightly different applications in real life. One is what's called supervised learning. So this is where you have a data set and you know what the truth is, right? So you know that in a particular data set, some cases are of people that have dementia, and some cases are of people that don't have dementia. And then you have a lot of data on them spanning, say, 30 years ahead of time. And what in supervised learning you would do is you'd ask this computer to say, what's different about the two groups? Okay, learn about these two different groups in the 30 years that lead to dementia, and then take this knowledge to another data set where we don't know who's who, and tell me. Okay, so this is supervised learning, where you're teaching first this algorithm, as they call it, what is the ground truth, and then you unleash it onto data sets. So that's typically the ones that you use in medical science. Okay. Then you have unsupervised learning, which is where you don't know what the data shows, but you're asking it, find me patterns here that I'm not seeing readily. Okay, and the sort of things that this thing is already being used for is, for example, where large banking corporations are looking for fraud, right? Anything that's out of the ordinary, right? They have all your transactions, 1 million transactions going through Barclays every day, and then they teach these algorithms to work out, somebody's doing something that's not quite right. It doesn't fit the pattern. They're paying something in, they've always been buying things off Amazon, and now suddenly they're buying things in Malaysia, and then this pings a signal that that's not quite right. Okay, so this is sort of unsupervised learning and clustering. And then you have natural language processing, which is where the the computers are able to detect patterns in speech and in language. Okay, these are your chatbots, and this is what has been implemented in large language models like ChatGPT. Who of you has had a go at ChatGPT? Okay, yeah, it's pretty amazing, right? Because they, it knows, right? You put the question in. It's not like you're putting it into a Google search where it gives you lots of random searches. It is genuinely like talking to somebody, or at least typing to somebody who understands what it is. And when you ask it to produce things, lo and behold, it makes sense, right, to us as humans. So that's natural language processing. And all of these three different things have implication for dementia. And I'll try and convince you that there is something in there, right? There's obviously a lot of hype in dementia, but there's people who are actively thinking about what is the actual value here. And why AI matters for dementia is one, goes back to what John was talking about, is that dementia is a complex multifactorial condition. We like to think in very simple categories, but as there was a question that alluded online, just within dementia, we know that there's a lot of different things that get called dementia, but actually it's very different processes. And even for the actual categories that we think we know what's going on, like Alzheimer's disease, it turns out that there's extreme complexity within that. And I'll give you a simple example. If you develop Alzheimer's disease age 60, you have a disease which is completely different from developing Alzheimer's disease at the age of 80, right? And that's more or less a fact, okay? And the reason for that is when you have it early on in life, it's genetics that lead to a relatively pure type of protein problem, okay, that has to do with amyloid and tau. While if you look at somebody diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease at the age of 80, it sort of looks the same. You have, the same proteins are involved, but actually if you look into the brains, you'll find out that there's a lot more going on. There's a lot more problems with the vessels of the brain. There's a lot more additional things that we know are important for dementia, like Lewy body dementia and so on. So the etiologies are very complex. As John was talking about, the causation is very complex, as in there's a lot of different things that feed into why we may or may not develop dementia at the age of 80. So very complex condition. The second factor is that there's a data explosion. This is hopefully, John again drove home to you, is that there are a lot of very different types of data sets that have their own idiosyncrasies and are very different, and we just need a way of integrating them in a way that makes sense to us, because otherwise it's just overwhelming data. And what this boils down to is that there is a potential here that this technology may help with detection of dementia and also personalizing care. And I'll speak about how we've approached this in our research, just to give you a few simple examples. One is that we've used AI to look at the problem of addressing the complexity. And one particular case is the one of what's called preclinical dementia. So a key challenge of dementia is that we know that it starts decades before first symptoms, okay? So by the time people come to see me or Vanessa in the clinic, we know that people have, by the time they have even relatively minor symptoms, we know that this is a process that has been going on for about 20 years. How do we know this? We know this because there have been these studies that have collected tests on people who are at high risk to develop dementia for decades, and they can pinpoint the time at which they start seeing amyloid proteins build up, then tau proteins. They know when the nerve tissue starts to die off, and these things happen decades before people actually have any symptoms. So a particular challenge here is to identify these people early on. So in a previous study, we were able to show that mapping out genetics plus age plus sex plus some of the lifestyle risk factors can tell us whether somebody has buildup of Alzheimer's disease pathology, but they don't have any symptoms, okay, which was very interesting. But then we said, what if we put AI on the same data sets? Do we gain anything compared to our usual statistical methods? And we found that with this AI approach, where basically it's able to look at the entirety of the data, there was a measurable increase in the accuracy. And importantly, the accuracy wasn't so much in detecting people who are in preclinical form of Alzheimer's disease, it was detecting people with the forms of dementia that we don't know that much about. So people who had dementia due to frontotemporal dementia, or people who had Parkinson's disease, okay? Because we don't quite know with the established tests, you know, what mediates why somebody develops frontotemporal dementia 20 years down the line, Lewy body dementia down the line. But this AI method was good at detecting preclinical Alzheimer's disease, as good as our other standard methods. But as far as the rarer dementias were concerned, it was clearly better than what we could have done had we not used the more complex method. So that's one. And the other one that we thought about is, can we address the complexity of treating dementia today? And there's a particular challenge for me as a dementia specialist, in that the currently available medications that we have, there's 4 of them, they're cognitive enhancers, they give a bit of boost to people's attention when they develop dementia. We were able to show previously in very large data sets from NHS trusts, where we're able to look at over 24,000 healthcare records. We were able, with what's called the natural language processing, right, decoding what the language means, with this form of AI, we were able to ask it, okay, find me where in these 24,000 patient records, when is the medication prescribed, and tell me what's happening to these people sort of in terms of their cognitive ability. What do their cognitive tests show over time? And what we found is that basically across nearly 4 million individual clinical documents, we were able to map out the response to these drugs that we prescribe in everyday practice. And we show that it's about, people get benefits for about 2 to 5 months, after which they continue on their decline. So this here is the point at which the drug gets prescribed. People stabilize for about 2 to 5 months, and then they continue to decline, which is really speaks to what we know about clinical practice. So in a way, it was good to know as a sense check that this is what's coming out of the data. But the next question, which I find particularly interesting, is what we asked as a follow-up, which was, okay, so we know that this work, we know that these artificial intelligence models can read these complex clinical data notes, right? Because all that we're giving them is essentially nurses and doctors writing in free text, I saw Mr. X and they were doing well, their cat had died, and so on. So he was able to trawl through all of that information and give us something that actually made sense in a graph. So the next question was, given that we know we've got these 4 drugs, which me and Vanessa will tell you, there really isn't much of a difference between them in terms of what patients can expect to get in terms of benefit, right? We're prescribing them because one of them is a bit easier on the tummy, the other ones because we think it's slightly better when people are a bit more advanced and so on, but ultimately there isn't much to it. In fact, for 3 of them, we just consider that they're carbon copies of each other. But what we did is in 6,800 dementia patients in the UK, we asked the question, what if we train the data set first to tell it, to basically teach it, to say, this is what happens after a patient A that is 45, that is 65 years old, is a man living alone and so on, is prescribed this drug, see what happens to their memory and thinking, okay? And you repeat that for 6,800 people. And then what this model then learned is what drug works best for what kind of patient, okay? Which is something that we don't do in practice. We don't think in these terms when we're prescribing these medications. And then importantly, we were able to say, okay, now go into another NHS trust, and given that you know what is the ideal medication out of the 4, which we think are equivalent, what happens when the doctors prescribe the ideal medication that the algorithm thinks this particular patient should be prescribed, versus a case where the doctors chose one of the other 4 drugs, right, which the AI machine doesn't think that it's the ideal. And what we saw is basically this graph, okay? So the blue one is the time in which people stay stable over 2 years, or what's happening in terms of their memory and thinking. Sort of, if the line goes further down, then it's getting worse. In blue line are the people where the algorithm and the doctor agree, which is the most appropriate medication, and in yellow is where there's a disagreement, right? So the doctor chose a different one out of these 4 random medications. And what it shows is that if for the people where the doctor and the algorithm agreed, the patients had a benefit of about 6 to 12 months longer better memory and thinking skill compared to the scenarios where the doctor didn't prescribe what was on the surface completely the same medications. Okay, so something very interesting. So this AI model is somehow deriving some meaningful data out of something that for us as doctors just doesn't exist. So very interesting. And then moving on to would AI perhaps help us with some of the other challenges in dementia, which is, I'm going to say 3 things. Okay, one is precision, and what I mean by this is that despite us being dementia specialists and having seen a lot of dementia patients, actually we're not very good. Okay, so what I mean by this is that if you ask us, what is, you've seen this patient with dementia, do they have Alzheimer's disease, yes or not? And then we do the tests, and once they die, we check whether they actually have Alzheimer's disease. The degree of agreement isn't very good. It's in the 40 to 50% range. Okay, so there is a precision problem. Also, due to the nature of certainly the way that the NHS is funded, the vast majority of people are not even seen by people who are very experienced, but rather we have a lot of people who are seen by nurses and so on, who are excellent in what they do, but perhaps they haven't seen that many people with Lewy body dementia or with frontotemporal dementia and so on. So there's a challenge there. Then there's a challenge of equity in that, in particular, some people have access to academic centers who deal a lot with dementia, and then some people just don't have access to clinicians who speak their language. Okay, and then you have the problem of people who are of different educational attainments. Okay, and yet they're all tested with the same paper-based cognitive test. Okay, which in somebody who's and that happens very often, where you see somebody who's a very high cognitive attainment, you give them one of these tests that are validated for dementia, it doesn't show much. Okay, even though if you speak to their partner, things are clearly not well, right? So there's something about equity. And then the third problem, which I'm going to say is the most significant, is one of care fragmentation. Anyone in the room who has dealt with the healthcare system will know that it's a complex system with multiple stakeholders, and it takes cognitive ability, right? And it takes drive for you as the person affected to actually make sure that people are talking to each other, to make sure that things are being followed up on, and so on. And you can imagine that if the person affected is somebody with dementia, okay, who doesn't carry over information easily, who finds it difficult to get out of bed in the morning, this is not the person that will be able to coordinate a complex care like this. So I'm going to put it to you that AI may offer a solution for this. And this is a project that I'm working on at the moment, in which we are developing what's called a conversational agent, right? So this is essentially a device which records a conversation. In this particular case, it will be in a clinical setting where the clinician speaks to a patient and arrives at a diagnosis. And what this conversational agent does is that it learns over time what do people with dementia sound like, and what are the type of questions that the best doctors in the business are asking, so that as the conversation goes, you can both give suggestions as to what is the most appropriate diagnosis, but also for the people who haven't seen that many patients, it tells them, well, maybe you should ask about family history, or you should ask about, has their appetite changed, has their sense of humor changed, because maybe you're missing frontotemporal dementia. So that's one. So once this model is trained, you can then because the large language models don't really care about whether this is done in English or in Punjabi or in Urdu, you can then develop this to actually be interviewing patients directly who are not non-English speakers, and so that by the time they arrive at the appointment with the actual doctor, with an interpreter, you actually have the most relevant questions already having been asked in their natural in their natural language. And then we'll integrate this with biomarker data, which Vanessa will be talking to us about in terms of blood biomarkers. And then finally, the final piece is that these conversational agents then also allow you to breach the fragmentation problem that I spoke to you about. How would they do that? They would allow, because these are essentially, automated, they can speak, they can reproduce human speech. They can give a call with appropriate permission to the GP, to the social care, to the person looking after the patient with dementia, and ask them 5 to 10 questions about what is happening with this person. What is their living situation? What medications are they supposed to be on? Do they have care coming in at home? When they're unwell, what do they look like? Okay, all right. So, and what this builds is this map of what the person with dementia looks like. And then the next time they come into secondary care, into an acute hospital with infection, then this becomes a trusted environment where the doctor admitting the patient can go in and can actually say, well, now I understand what this person with dementia is living with. Because otherwise the reality is somebody with dementia comes in, they're extremely unwell, they're disoriented, and then assumptions are made because you don't have access to the ground information. And a lot of the doctors will say, well, maybe that's normal for them. Maybe it's normal that they don't know what day of the week it is. But actually, if you had the background information, you will know that yesterday, yes, they have been diagnosed with dementia, but up to yesterday, they were actually functioning quite well. So this is not the dementia itself. Something else is going on. They have a urinary tract infection, or they have a stroke, and it's the critical thing. And then the other thing, that having a trusted environment that integrates information about dementia, is that it then allows people who are in hospital to go home quicker. Because a lot of the time, I used to work in the John Radcliffe. The reason why people are staying with dementia, staying longer in hospital, is because the doctors on the ward and the social workers, they don't know what the situation at home is. They don't know who's looking after them. Is there a care package? Who has attorney of power? Okay, power of attorney, and all of these things take weeks to resolve, in the course of which the person with dementia gets an infection, right? Gets a pneumonia, and stays in hospital for another 3 or 4 weeks, where the cycle starts again because somebody's been on leave, and so on. So you can see how having an actual integration and pulled in coordination of care can be hugely beneficial. This is a project we are working as part of the Dementias Platform UK renewal. And that's what I wanted to talk to you about, just to give you a flavor of the sort of potentials of AI. We shouldn't, however, underestimate that there's a lot of hype about dementia, and we have to be aware of the problems. There are limitations. The first one is that people will always want their care to be delivered by a human. I think that's a natural expectation. However, what I would say to this is that AI certainly wouldn't replace doctors, but there's a good chance that it may replace doctors doctors who use technology competently are likely to replace those that don't. Okay, I think that's a reasonable expectation. The second problem with AI, that it's a black box. Okay, it's the inner workings of why the AI is telling you that you should prescribe one medication instead of another is so complex that I couldn't explain it to the patient. All I can say, well, the computer says that I should prescribe you this drug, which is not an ideal situation. Okay, and you certainly don't want to be in a situation where you can't access some care because the computer says that you won't benefit. Okay, a computer says no type of situation. So that's a concern. And then finally, all digital data is vulnerable. The only type of digital data that is not vulnerable is one that sits on a computer that is just disconnected from all cables. The only cable that it's connected to is the power outlet, right? So there's an inherent vulnerability, and that is something we have to be aware of. But that's what I wanted to talk to you about. I hope that's been interesting. Thank you.
Early on, you said about genetic reasons and lifestyle reasons, and it's in my mind it seemed to imply that the earlier you got dementia, it's more likely to be genetic, whereas later it's more likely to be lifestyle. Do you have any further comments on that?
Well, yeah, thank you. So well spotted. So in earlier life, so if you develop, as a rule of thumb, if you develop dementia under the age of 65, in the vast majority of the cases, it's due to genes, and it's primarily 3 genes. And I can tell you what they are, but in effect, you've inherited from your parents. Very often, your parents had dementia at an early age, and in fact, if you had one of these genes, the chances are that you'll develop it at pretty much the same point in life as your parents developed dementia. And these genes tend to have what's called high penetrance. It means that if you have it, it's extremely likely that you'll get dementia. As you move beyond the age of 65, there are genetic factors. There is a gene called ApoE4, but it's a risk gene, right? So if you have one version of this gene, that is the one sort of high risk gene, then you're about 4 times higher risk of developing dementia. If you have 2 copies, then you're about 10 times the risk, okay? But it's still not a given that you will develop dementia. And then in that group, you're right that the estimation is that about 30 to 40% of the dementia cases are due to preventable risk factors, okay? And these broadly can be summarized as things that have to do with the heart, okay, cardiovascular risk factors, things that have to do with what's happened to you during your early to midlife, things like education and how cognitively and physically active you were. And then the third factor is around how are you living now that you're over the age of 65. So what John was talking about in terms of physical activity, social activity, intellectual activity, all of these 3 things then feed into the lifestyle factors, and why we think about 40% of all dementia cases over the age of 65 are preventable.
Thank you, Ivan. We've got a couple of questions online that are very similar. So how close do you think we are to achieving an integrated care model for dementia as shown on your later slides?
Well, I hope, I mean, the idea here is that the technology is there, okay? And certainly, for those of you, obviously there was a lot of people in the room that have tried interacting with ChatGPT. So this ability to have a direct conversation with a computer, this is, in the past 3 or 4 years, right? We know that the translation to spoken speech has already happened. So the technological capacity is there. Now we have to run the studies to show that A, it's valuable, right? It brings something to the table. 2, it's safe, right? It's giving recommendations that are actually reasonable to give and they don't put people at risk. And that 3, it's ethical, right? We understand what's happening to the data, who has access to the data, how safe it is, and so on. So these are the tasks that we need to do, and we're running the projects. That's what I can say. But given that the technology is there, I imagine that this is the type of innovation that is much more likely to become part of daily sort of clinical practice than, for example, it is if we were starting to work up a molecule to treat Alzheimer's disease. That has a 15, 20-year sort of horizon. This one is much shorter.
And I think we'll just take one more question, and then I think everyone deserves a tea break. So another one online. Following on from what you've just said, Ivan, can you envisage a system of appropriate checks and balances for the use of AI in clinical care?
I think that is the big problem with artificial intelligence, is the checks and balances. For those of you that are interested in the topic, there's a couple of books out there on the 2 main companies that developed AI, and that question that you asked, Simon, has been at the core of the conflict within AI. Is that AI researchers have always tried to have sort of raised alarms that, that there has to be appropriate checks and balances. And I'm not sure that anyone has the complete answer to this. I would say that if a technology is entering the healthcare space, it's already so heavily regulated that I think implementing checks and balances within healthcare, I think, is achievable. Okay. Once you're thinking about AI in a broader sense, like, how it interacts with our other daily life, like, what happens to our banking data and what happens to, to the way that it just manages our whole life. I think that's a much more sort of complex question. But within healthcare, I find that because we already have such sophisticated regulation, I think it's easier and more conceivable to see how an innovation using AI will be regulated to a good standard.
What I want to really talk about is, about some of the background to biomarkers and some of the questions and challenges. But even before that, I think it's, many of us in the room will be aware of dementia. It affects many of our families. It's all over the newspapers. Sometimes we're told there's things that we're doing well that will help us beat dementia. Sometimes the newspapers are full of things that we're getting wrong that will make us succumb to dementia. Sometimes it's more neutral, sort of bits of optimism that there's progress on the way. Obviously, we take all these newspaper headlines with a pinch of salt. But between all this sort of noise and sort of journalism, there is actually a lot of hope now that there's the end is in sight, or at least the end of the beginning. I say that not only because there are already some drugs that have been approved for use in the UK and around the world, one called lecanemab, another donanemab, and some others for rarer dementias that are beginning to make inroads against this illness. But it's not just these early drugs, sort of first of a generation drugs. There are many other treatment approaches, drugs and different approaches to treatment that are coming through quickly through clinical trials. So this little target diagram on the right summarizes the 170 or so clinical trials against Alzheimer's disease that are going on around the world as we speak. Some of which will fail, others will break through and add to the armamentarium how we can try and treat and eventually prevent dementia. But one of the features is none of these will work for everybody, and even when they do, they'll only work if it's given to the right patient with the right illness at the right time, which really puts a strong emphasis on getting an early and accurate diagnosis. And this is really where the world of blood-based biomarkers will, we hope, improve things and enable people to get an earlier and more accurate diagnosis. It really hit the headlines about 18 months ago that there's been a big breakthrough in a blood test, particular blood test for Alzheimer's disease, not yet for other forms of dementia. This didn't come out of the blue. This is work that's been going on for really 20 years by colleagues in the sort of laboratories behind the scenes in the Alzheimer's world. But they really made some major breakthroughs over the last couple of years showing how these blood tests can be extremely accurate and sensitive to Alzheimer's disease and are almost precisely the same as the very expensive and difficult to get PET scan tests that have been around for the previous 10 to 15 years. Now it's less than £100 for a blood test to get the equivalent result. And in the big research studies and in the right hands, you'll see headlines saying that these are 95% accurate, and it makes it sound very easy that, well, surely that's enough. 95% accurate is good enough. And I think it's very exciting, but what I'll spend the next few minutes talking about is accuracy is not enough. We need to think about the setting, and we still need to think about individual people with different causes for symptoms over and above Alzheimer's disease. And to understand this and why blood tests have some particular challenges in dementias is to understand that dementias unfold over our entire lifespan. They're not just something that arrives out of the blue when we're old. There's a lifespan here of the dementia disease that brews in the background. So much of the focus, I think, in the public's mind and in medical mind of recent years is focused on the late stage dementia when people are disabled, perhaps dependent for activities of everyday life, might even be in residential or nursing care. The dementia, severe illness. But for many people, for most people, there's 5, 10, sometimes 15 years of a milder prodrome, a milder set of problems something that's called mild cognitive impairment, where life is near normal, nearly normal, but with some symptoms that may anything from losing the keys around the house, losing the car in a car park, being a bit more disoriented on complicated car journeys, or just simply finding that one needs to rely more on notebooks and diaries. So it's mild and persistent memory problems, but not very disabling. Life is near normal. And as I said, that can be 5, 10, sometimes 15 years before a more disabling dementia. But the illness, the disease, doesn't start with mild cognitive impairment. Actually, even 10 years before that, there are subtle, very subtle signs of brain shrinkage that the illness in our brain may be on the move without any symptoms. But even that doesn't come out of the blue. Before there's shrinkage, there are some biochemical and cell changes in the brain where some of the connections in the brain break down. And actually, even from early adulthood, there's can be a slow buildup of junk proteins. These are proteins that our brains need to operate properly. Normally, these proteins are very orderly and they're very well structured. They behave well. They do what they're supposed to and don't do anything they shouldn't. But rather like well-orderly spaghetti, if you cook it and change its shape, it can go sticky and gooey. And it's a bit like this with these proteins. They change their shape, they become sticky, they gum up in great big clumps in the brain cells and lead to this breakdown of connections that damages cells, that leads on to shrinkage, that leads to mild symptoms and eventually to dementia. And this unfolds over decades. So it's not something that just arrives suddenly when we're 75 or 80. This is happening throughout our lifespan. If we think about dementia services, I think for many years, and certainly up until very recently, there's been a lot of focus on this disabling late stage, the dementia itself with high dependency. That's shifted in many parts of the world and most parts of the NHS to thinking about this milder, earlier run-in period where there are definite symptoms, but independent is that life is there's everything to fight for. And there's also a challenge, though, that some people with these mild cognitive symptoms, it does represent the thin end of the wedge, the beginnings of that dementia illness. But for others, these annoying symptoms will grumble on, but without really getting substantially worse. And it's been a challenge to say, which half are you in? Are you in the half that's going to, be annoyed, but basically okay for the next 10 years? Or in the half where it's the beginning of a relatively rapid decline over a small number of years? And that's one of the roles we'll come back to in a moment around where blood tests might help. So these are described as early symptoms, but actually its early stage in the illness is actually really quite a long way down this lifespan of the biology, lifespan of the disease. It's actually very late in the day. Where we want to be going to is before symptoms even begin, thinking about future treatments where we might be able to pick up on the fact that there's some biological illness beginning, but without any symptoms. Perhaps an analogy for this is to think about stopping hardening of the arteries before there's a stroke and before there's a heart attack. There is disease brewing in the body, but it's not causing any symptoms that bother us. But we could try and treat it then to prevent the consequences. Of course, we don't know that everybody will get symptoms. So those symptoms might be many years off, but in principle, you could think about trying to intervene at this very early stage. So let's come and think about how this might play out for blood tests. If I start in an imaginary hospital setting or clinic setting, an outpatient clinic and a memory clinic, a memory assessment service, where essentially in a typical memory clinic, everybody has symptoms. That's why you're there. Okay? When everybody has symptoms, the question is why and what you can do about it. But if everybody has symptoms, through the current discussion with the doctor, an examination, perhaps some memory tests, perhaps a scan, a good proportion, perhaps a third, will have benign causes. They don't have the beginnings of a dementia. Their memory symptoms that are very real and troubling might be caused by stress or depression or the medication side effects, for example, painkillers or epilepsy medications, head injury. There's all sorts of causes for memory symptoms that are not progressive and not dementias. There's a proportion of people who would have this mild cognitive impairment. Now, about half of those are going to progress at a significant rate into dementia, but at the time one first sees them in clinic, it's not a dementia, it's these mild but non-disabling symptoms. Of course, some people will have Alzheimer's disease, a fair chunk of people, including pointer, including about half of those people with mild cognitive impairment and others with more significant memory symptoms. So some people will have Alzheimer's disease, and of course, some people have other types of dementia. There are many different types of dementia. Alzheimer's is the most common, but it's only one of several possibilities. So in a typical memory clinic, it then becomes very, very useful to think about a blood test or any kind of test, but a blood test for its simplicity that could rule in or rule out Alzheimer's disease. And it's just as useful to rule out Alzheimer's disease in these people that are worried, but essentially, long-term are going to be well. It's helpful to rule out Alzheimer's disease in these people in red. You've got mild cognitive impairment, but a low risk of progression. That you're trying to rule out Alzheimer's disease. Or indeed people with another form of dementia where you say it is a dementia, but it's not Alzheimer's disease. Let's look a bit further to get to the bottom of it. So ruling it out can be useful, but so can ruling Alzheimer's in to say either your mild cognitive impairment is due to early stages of Alzheimer's disease, or your more severe memory symptoms are indeed due to Alzheimer's disease. Let's now get to grips with that. Let's treat that. But in either case, you need to really think about, what is a doctor? Why am I doing this test? Why am I taking the blood? Just as you would about why am I doing a brain scan or any other more complicated test. So this is the sort of situation we're faced with in a memory clinic. And many memory clinics are already beginning to operate on this type of model, this type of way of operating, which is to say people are referred in with cognitive complaints, memory symptoms. They will meet a doctor, hopefully someone a bit more cheerful than this chap who looks a bit downbeat at the end of his clinic. Hopefully you'd get a slightly happier reception, but a clinical conversation, an assessment, examination, perhaps some memory tests. And if you're not cognitively impaired, you may have been worried, but they're not fundamentally ill in terms of your brain function. One can be reassured, and that's a clear diagnosis going forward. But if one does have cognitive deficits, so significant memory problems, then a rapid blood test will be able to say, is this due to Alzheimer's disease pathology? So it's cognitive impairment due to the presence of Alzheimer's disease in the body, in the brain. Or you are cognitively impaired, but it's not due to Alzheimer's disease, and indeed other tests are then necessary to really get to the bottom of it. Okay. So we need to look further, but this, by putting blood tests in this middle stage, one could move relatively quickly with low cost on NHS resources, short time delay, so no one's kept in the dark worrying any longer than they need to be, and get to a clearer diagnosis quicker. I think this is this sort of model works well in a memory clinic setting, but there's still more we need to do. There's still actually some tricky questions here. This is really where the readout study comes in to say, in the context of the type of person that's being referred to a memory clinic, actually, we need to understand the impact of ethnicity. We know enough about these biomarkers in blood and other body fluids like spinal fluid to know that ethnicity matters. If you have Asian, Afro-Caribbean background or Caucasian white background, they behave a bit differently. And we don't want to build in sort of health inequalities based on ethnicity by not using these tests fairly for an individual person. So we need to understand a lot more about ethnicity. And certainly traditionally, people with non-white backgrounds haven't really had a fair and proportionate place in a lot of the research. The research data has often come from very, very white populations at scale, and we know enough to know that that's a problem. There's also concerns that real people are on medications, and it's known that some medications interfere with the test. And you wouldn't want to be told the wrong answer, do I or don't I have Alzheimer's disease, because, for example, a blood pressure medication interfered with the test. So we really need to understand properly how common medications affect the test results. And another big problem is other health conditions. Real people have more than one problem. We might have diabetes and blood pressure or kidney trouble, arthritis, a whole range of things. And again, we know enough to be worried that some of these other health conditions interfere with the tests. So part of the job of the readout study, as part of Dementias Platform UK, is to get enough data from, if I might call it, real people in real memory clinics to unpick these problems and find out how do we correct for or adjust for the presence of different medications, different health conditions. And hopefully we'll have those answers for you all and for the world in about 18 months. The readout study is going very strongly at the moment. And my colleague, Professor Raymont, will talk a bit more about the design of the study in a moment. So in the readout study, with these blood tests, we'll be asking how well do they work? Who do they work for? When do they work? Do you have to wait till you're into the dementia stage for them to work? What about this mild cognitive impairment? What about 10, 20 years earlier? When in this lifespan do they work? And a question that I think in the past often been forgotten is to say, do they actually overall improve the quality of life? If you were to take 100 people with a blood test and you do the blood test and report back, on average, are people healthier and happier at the end of the day? Blood test results, there's pros and cons. Yes, you want to move forward with a correct diagnosis and move to treatment, but there's sometimes a downside to over-enthusiastic screening. There's what we call false positives and false negatives. No test is perfect. And those imperfections with false positive and false negative results can have really very serious consequences for the individuals involved. So we need to know, do we actually improve the quality of life by doing these blood tests as opposed to current methods? So I've talked so far about the memory clinic setting. I want to just think about why it's a bit more complicated and difficult to look at the general public and healthy people. You say, well, surely a blood test would help. Surely it would work. If it's 95% accurate, surely it would work. And the next couple of minutes, I'm going to just introduce an idea as to why it's a little bit more complicated than that, and it's still not resolved. But I'd like you to imagine 100 people at 80, not with dementia, feeling well, busy, active retirements. But because of being old, there's a certain background rate at which, as we get older, these blood tests start to become positive. You start to get little bits of Alzheimer's in the body without causing symptoms, but enough to trigger the blood tests results. So at 80, about 1 in 3 people will be positive on these blood tests. Not because of dementia, these would be healthy people going about their retirement well, but it would still trigger a positive blood test. Now, some of those people who are positive, about 2/3, would eventually, during their lifetime, get a dementia, like Alzheimer's dementia. But not all, and it might yet be 10 years off. But the majority, we think, would probably eventually get a dementia, but not yet, maybe not for some years. But there's another problem here, which is not just not everybody with a positive result will get a dementia. I'd like to imagine that some people might have symptoms, memory symptoms. But of course, memory symptoms can come from many different reasons. It might be medication. Some medications can make you feel sleepy and foggy-headed and have a poor memory. You might have other illnesses like a stroke. You might have stress or anxiety or depression, all of which can interfere with memory. So I'd like you to imagine that we have a proportion of patients who develop memory symptoms because of those other treatable reasons. And now you come along and think about, let's do a blood test, and we'll find people who have those symptoms but are also positive by virtue of their age. And there's a real risk that those people I've outlined in the red circle, people will jump to conclusions. They will say, the doctors will jump to conclusions and say, your memory symptoms are surely because you're Alzheimer's positive on the blood test. You have Alzheimer's disease. Even if it's not the case, even if those 3 people I've ringed here in the red circle have memory symptoms for completely different reasons, much more benign, easy to sort out reasons. So there's more to being accurate as a blood test than there appears initially. And this kind of overcalling of Alzheimer's disease is a real hazard. And of course, there'll be people who will go on to get other dementias, not Alzheimer's, who might be given false reassurance. If they're not positive on this test, you might think you're home and dry, but there are other illnesses and the reassurance might be falsely reassuring. So I've sort of touched on some of these issues and said that blood tests are coming to clinic, they're coming to the memory services, they're beginning to have a presence in NHS clinics, and over the next couple of years, even more so, and they can add value to a memory assessment. But they're not yet ready to roll out nationwide. So I would say this is really exciting, but there's still a bit of work to be done to work out the details. And one of the reasons to be cautious about this is lessons from the cancer world. So If you go back to the 90s and 2000s, with the advent of cancer screening techniques, and this was rolled out in a very active way across the board for many types of cancer, across a wide range of ages, bowel cancer, breast cancer, prostate cancer, across a wide range of ages. And it turned out that this problem about false positives and false negatives, for a significant proportion of people, it did more harm than good. And the cancer world had to pull back and actually be very, very specific about when and why do we do cancer screening in order to make sure we do more good than harm. And that was a very sort of painful lesson, that this over-enthusiasm for screening backfired for many patients, or people who are healthy. They weren't patients, indeed they were healthy, but they were sort of turned into patients. And so as we move forward with this very exciting possibility of better diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease, we also need to be mindful not to repeat those mistakes from our cancer colleagues 10, 20 years ago. So last couple of thoughts is what can you do? Well, one is to look after your brain health, and I'm sure you've heard more about this through the Great Minds Project. And awareness, the fact you're here today suggests you're thinking and aware of brain health and things that we can all do as individuals to look after it. I'd also say support your NHS. If you're well, the NHS, it's having difficulty at the moment, but it is still a phenomenal resource. And compared to many parts of the world, I think we're extremely lucky to have the NHS as it is. But if you're worried about yourself or your partner, come forward. Do come forward to memory assessment services. And the last thought is enjoy research. Take part in research. Research can't happen without you. I think research should certainly be interesting and fun to take part in. And I certainly encourage you to continue to take part. The fact you're here today suggests you already are a part of research, and we're very grateful to you for that, and grateful for your time and thoughts and listening today.
Firstly, James, a comment from somebody just saying your 12 to 15 years of near normal life is tremendously heartening for those people that are endeavouring to live with the disease. So thank you for that. But then two questions that are very related. One is, can you get the blood test privately? And a related question from somebody with family history of dementia saying, would I qualify to have a blood biomarker test?
Yeah, two great questions. So if the question is, can you get the blood test privately? I'd say, first of all, should you get it? You need to really think about how will it help me if it's positive? How will it help me if it's negative? Why am I wanting to explore this? And that needs some advice from someone who knows what they're doing, so that if and when you go for a blood test, whether it's private or NHS, it's a result that's useful, that can be interpreted. It's not something to be done lightly. Okay. Technically the answer is yes. It's available for some private providers. It's also actually available increasingly in NHS clinics, and we'll see that more and more over the next 12 months. Whether it's private or NHS, it needs to come with advice about why am I interested? Why might this be useful to me now? It'd be very easy to misinterpret the results. So if you are a healthy 65 or 70-year-old and you come up with a a positive blood test, that means that there's a little bit of Alzheimer's in your body, in the system. It doesn't mean you have dementia today, and it doesn't mean you've got dementia tomorrow. It doesn't even mean you'll ever get dementia. It changes the chances. It changes the likelihood of dementia over the next 5, 10, 20 years. But it's not saying you have dementia now. There needs to be a much broader assessment to think about that. So yes, it's available in private providers, but first of all, one needs to think, should I? And I've forgotten the second question there on my memory.
Do I qualify to have a blood biomarker test if?
Yeah, so I think this is a very sort of rapidly changing scene. If you'd gone back a year ago, I would have said no one qualifies because none of them are available. In a year or two, I think they'll be very widely available. And at the moment, it's a bit patchy as it starts to come in different parts of the country at different speed. I think where we'll be into next year is saying, if you have memory symptoms or related sort of cognitive symptoms that's been assessed and thought about what might be the other causes, could it be early stages of dementia, then you would be eligible to have the blood test to either confirm or to rule it out. In essence, it should be no different from an MRI scan. The reason it's different is it's so cheap. But the thinking behind it will be, is this test going to be helpful to rule in or rule out dementia. And that's really the key eligibility. It's not about the cost, it's around, is it going to be useful for you as an individual with guidance?
You mentioned that the drugs, or was it a previous person? Drugs for Alzheimer's are better given at an early stage of dementia. So perhaps people like me are wondering if that means it is actually worth having a test done at an earlier stage or not. And how do we know whether our memory changes, like when I search for words, means that I've got dementia on the way or not? How does one actually know for oneself or one's partner or anyone else?
It's a very good question, one we hear a lot. So there are lots of memory symptoms that are entirely normal. I imagine almost everyone in the room has had the experience, you walk upstairs and you forget why you've gone there. You go to the phone and it's a number you phoned every day to your partner or child, and you go blank. Or you go into the kitchen, you open the cupboard and you think, why have I opened the cupboard? These are not the types of memory symptoms you get with dementia. These are very common experiences, actually throughout the lifespan. From 20s and 30s, they're very common, but they start to bother people as we come into mid and later life, partly because they're a little bit more common. Actually, one of the reasons they bother us so much is our worry over, could this be the start of Alzheimer's? 20-year-olds don't worry about getting dementia. So when they get this momentary blank or lapse, it doesn't have any significance. But if we're 60 or 65, it suddenly has a lot of significance and worry. But they're different from the sorts of memory symptoms that come with early dementias. Actually getting lost, truly forgetting a bit of information, not just having it on the tip of your tongue, but having forgotten you've had that conversation with your spouse earlier in the day, having forgotten where you are or how to get home and on a familiar route. These are not momentary lapses. These are much a very different quality to them. If you're in doubt, come forward and talk either to your GP or to a memory specialist or a memory clinic and help them work out if these are momentary lapses, what we call attentional lapses, which are much more common as we get older. They're more common if we're stressed or if we're tired. They're much more common if we're on some medications, particularly painkillers, for example, or sleeping medications. But they're not the same as a dementia. This leads on to getting the idea, am I in the early stages and what about treatment? So we often hear, it's almost a dogma now that treating dementia earlier is more effective. What I'd say, it's reasonable to expect it to be true. It sounds plausible. It hasn't actually been shown. You have to remember that. And I think myself and scientific colleagues, when we're giving talks and or writing articles, we have to remember it sounds plausible. It has not actually been shown. It's the direction of travel, and there are studies ongoing to try and test, is it true? If we go 10 years earlier, would it be more effective? But there is a sort of catch to this, which is if you're in the middle of a significant dementia type illness, the kind of risks you might take for treatment, I think many of us would accept a higher risk, a bit like if we have cancer. The cancer treatments, if you've ever known somebody or have family members going through chemotherapy, these are tough treatments with severe side effects, actually a certain mortality associated with them. But we do it for cancer because the alternative is so much worse. And the alternative is really, it's kind of right, it's happening now. When we come to some of the dementia treatments, they don't appear to be quite as toxic, but they're not trivial either, especially the current generation of anti-Alzheimer treatments. They do have some significant risks. When people have definite symptoms and the dementia has already begun, many people say that's a risk I'm willing to take. But if you went very early, 10 years before that, and it's not quite clear, maybe I might get dementia later, maybe not, might be fast, but maybe not. The acceptable level of risk changes. So I think we really need to do this research studies to say, do they work earlier, as we think, but we've never shown? And are they safe enough to apply early? So if I come back to this example about trying to prevent strokes and heart attacks by treating hardening of the arteries, we treat blood pressure, we treat cholesterol from people, from early life, 20s, 30s, 40s. And we do that not just because it works, but these are very, very safe treatments. Statins, blood pressure tablets, a baby aspirin a day, they're very, very safe. And so it makes sense to roll them out across the population for prevention. That wouldn't be the case for the current anti-Alzheimer treatments. You certainly wouldn't roll those out as liberally as you would for aspirin or a statin. Not yet. New treatments, better prevention, there will be progress in this direction, but not yet.
Thank you, James. There's quite a few questions online on a similar topic. How can a blood test be more harm than good? Related, would it be difficult to have a test and it show positive? Do you think it will cause extra worry? One from a lady whose husband has now sadly died, but he was performed well in tests, but he got an MCI diagnosis and was advised not to work, drink or drive, which caused a lot of distress.
Yeah, so that's good. I mean, a terrible situation, but it's a good place to then come back and answer that first question. How could a blood test cause more harm than good? The blood test won't, I mean, unless someone's incompetent. It's a normal blood test. We've all had those. The blood test itself is harmless, but it's the news that you get. So if you get the news that says you're positive on the blood test, even if you're well, for many people, that will make us feel and think, my life has ended. I now have dementia. It might even tell somebody might tell you to stop those things we enjoy in life. It might tell you to stop work, stop driving prematurely. Maybe that person who has a positive blood test might never get ill. It might not be for 10 years. But if their life grinds to a halt, you haven't actually helped them necessarily. One of the things I fear is somebody who's basically well but has a positive blood test but is still well might have a very extreme reaction to that bad news, might get depressed, might even end their life because of the fear of a dementia that might be coming. And actually, the blood test hadn't told them they had dementia, hadn't said that they were imminently going to have disability. And so you can trigger enormous psychological harm by tests that are misinterpreted. It's not the test's fault. It's about understanding through advice and counselling what a test means and what it doesn't mean. So you can even an innocent blood test, you can actually do real harm with it. For many people, it's worry. Worry is not fatal. It's just unpleasant, but you can actually then cause real harm in a smaller percentage of recipients of bad news blood tests.
Great, thank you. Thank you, James. And I guess the other point to make is that sometimes we as doctors start treating the test result as opposed to the patient, right? So if there's a number that's not quite right, we want to fix the number. And that becomes a problem in its own right. Fine. Well, thank you very much, James. So we'll get back to you during the quick Q&A, and in the meantime, we'll move on to Vanessa. But thank you very much.
Thank you.
So I'm going to finish off the day, obviously, and just be a bit pragmatic. I think we've heard a lot already about the exciting times we're at in terms of potential new treatments, but also detecting people diagnosing people more accurately so we could access these new treatments. But I'm going to bring us back to earth and think, is this something that we can actually implement at scale in the healthcare systems that we have? So are we ready for blood-based diagnosis of dementia? So I think we'd all agree that dementia is really one of the greatest global health crises that we're all facing. Currently affects about 1 million people in the UK, about 50 million people worldwide, and the numbers are still going up. So in terms of developed countries, they are in effect reducing, but in the developing world, they are increasing. And a lot of that's to do with public health changes that we've implemented already around things like better cardiovascular health. But as we've heard, new drugs for Alzheimer's disease particularly are already with us, be it, as James raised, complexity, I would say, in terms of their benefit and the risks. The other thing that Ivan commented on as well is that we know a lot about risk factors that can progress what could be fairly benign disease in your brain. And again, James emphasized the fact that we know Alzheimer's disease starts years before dementia and does not progress in everybody. So it's a bit like heart disease. You have to almost have a perfect storm where there's other different things that come into line in order for you to know that you're going to progress. And that's the bit that's really difficult. But again, as Ivan highlighted earlier, we could prevent almost half of dementias if we manage those risks properly. And biomarkers are almost ready, as James said, maybe not quite there. And so I think overall, the public expectations are shifting. If I go back even a couple of years, I sat in meetings with other fellow clinicians and academics where we were still having discussions of whether we should if we could diagnose people with biomarkers, should we give people their results if there wasn't a treatment they could access? Now, I think if I went back a few years ago and asked people in my clinic, you probably get mixed results. Some people will always say, I don't want to know. I just want to manage this without knowing the details. But they're very few. And I think it's changing. And I think if you like this somewhat paternalistic view that the doctor should decide is definitely fading. And I think this has to be about patient and public choice. Maybe you don't want to know your biomarker status, but a lot of people would. And we shouldn't be the ones making those decisions. So the healthcare system has to be prepared to give you the information if it's accurate enough, and then you decide if and when you want it. So diagnosis management of dementia is evolving, but is the NHS ready? Well, again, you've already heard we've got 2 approved drugs in the UK. They haven't been approved by NICE. Those companies are actually appealing this week to NICE, so we will see whether that changes things. But again, this diagram, I'm not going to go into it in detail, is the one that Ivan referred to earlier. So from a paper from 2024 that highlighted all these risk factors that together add up to about 45% of modifiable risks that could reduce the risk of dementia overall. And certainly the charities in the UK are very vocal on this. They're saying we need to have an earlier diagnosis, we need to have a more accurate diagnosis, partly for the reason I said. This is about public and patient choice and information and empowering people so that you can do what you will with that, whether it's about thinking how you want to plan your future care, making sure you've got a will in place, making sure you've got power of attorney, but bringing us back to the real world. At the moment, only about 64% of people over 65 who have dementia, so not even milder impairment, get a diagnosis. And if we think about how we get that diagnosis, looking at a review just a couple of years ago, and I don't think it's changed drastically, unfortunately, the average waiting time to get a diagnosis in an NHS memory clinic was just over 17 weeks and ranged from anything from 6 months up to 2 years. So, the system is going to struggle if we want to do this better. And again, the point Ivan made about us getting it right, this is again quite an old paper, 2012, but it highlights that even on the good days, if you like, we get it right clinically. So we get your underlying disease diagnosis right in dementia in about 70% of cases. As Ivan said, sometimes that can drop down to 40 or 50 depending on the setting. And that's trained professionals who have been seeing people for years. And part of this, again, is the reasons that have been highlighted already, that particularly as we get older, our brains and our bodies are complicated. The aging process, most of us are suffering from other health conditions like cardiovascular disease or renal disease. All of these will have an impact on what's going on in your brain. So it is very difficult to tease apart whether the primary cause of your memory problem as you get older is Alzheimer's disease or something else, or a combination. And again, this is so exciting. You can see it twice. James put this slide up. Every year there is a publication about all the drugs in the clinical trial pipeline. This is about as busy as it's been for years. These are all the drugs of different sorts that are currently under test. This is massive. As I said, I have been working in the field for 30 years. If you went back about 20 years, all we saw was lots of drug failures and drug companies pulling their funding from developing these drugs. It is now going the other way. So we really are at a very exciting time in terms of new treatments that could delay Alzheimer's disease and ultimately maybe even prevent it. The other reason why it's important to have a good and accurate diagnosis is because, as we've said, we think probably the earlier you give the drug, the more impact it's going to have. So these are very famous curves that get shown a lot when we talk about Alzheimer's disease, but it's about thinking if we were able to give drugs in that what we call prodromal stage, where people have mild cognitive impairment, and maybe in the preclinical stage. So if we give it when people have symptoms and they have disease, we're talking about secondary prevention. If we could give something that could stop you getting Alzheimer's in the first place, that would be even better. But then we'd probably be talking about giving drugs in middle age. So a whole other category of treatment. And as James said, we don't know. There are a lot of trials looking at what we would call preclinical disease now, but we don't know the results yet. We don't know, as James said, whether the benefit of the drugs is good enough when you compare it with the risks to say, is this really something you want to roll out at scale? So what are the advantages of blood biomarkers? Well, again, we've gone through some of this. They're going to be really good for early detection and maybe for screening, but we're not there yet. Obviously, they are relatively easy to do, not massively painful, so they're cost effective, and there's something that can be implemented in infrastructure really easily, and they're affordable. So if we're thinking about using them to diagnose people or to track their disease once they've had a diagnosis, or to evaluate whether their treatment's making a difference and adjust their drugs, these could be really good. But there are challenges. As James has said, we still don't really understand how some of these blood tests act in people of different ages, to a certain extent different sex, based on genetics, ethnicity, etc. And so it's still unclear if you add blood tests into the existing pathway. Again, it sounds like a good idea, but there is a cost associated. And as James said, it's not always going to be a black and white answer you get from these blood tests. So are they actually going to add value to our memory clinic system as it stands? And to be honest, can we afford it? And I'm not saying that's a reason not to do blood tests. Like James, I think these are going to be increasingly used over the next few years. But ultimately, these are those healthcare decisions that our government has to make. And we recognise there's only so much resource in the pot for our NHS, and there's lots of need. We do have to think about if they add value. And then again, Ivan very nicely highlighted how useful these could be with AI. We could look for patterns in blood tests and symptoms, but there are challenges. And the other thing is the standardization of the tests themselves and the kit that measures the protein, whether those need to be standardized in a certain way so that if you have your blood test in Manchester or you have your blood test in London, it's going to measure the same way. So there are challenges. We also need to think, when are we going to do them? Are they going to be diagnostic when you get to a memory clinic? Are they going to be given by your GP to decide if you should go to a memory clinic? Are they going to be done remotely or not, so that you then go to your GP if you have a positive test? And what happens if you have a negative test? Do we need to repeat it after a year, after 2 years? You know, all of these things we still don't know because we haven't used them widely enough. And also, as we've highlighted, how are we going to disclose the information? How do you, if you have a positive or negative test, to a certain extent that's clearer, but again, as James highlighted, you've got to take into account all your other risks, or the potential for your disease progressing or not. And although a clinical assessment can help with that, so we are definitely at this point saying, having a blood test on its own is not a way of getting a definitive diagnosis or a definitive measure of your risk. But how do we quantify risk so that people understand that? It's a bit like when we talked about COVID and your risk. What's the best way of comparing it to other things so people understand? Do you want this in your medical records? You know, I heard from somebody recently that said they were concerned that they didn't get a certain level of insurance because of blood biomarker status. It's a big concern in the US, I think less here. And I know there have been discussions with government about this not being an issue. But again, I met somebody recently that felt this was still potentially slipping through the nets. And the other thing to bear in mind is that you'll still need a clinical assessment. And at the moment, if you look at the PET scans and the lumbar punctures that we use rather than blood tests, only 2% of people who come through memory clinics get those. And blood tests obviously are much easier to implement, but you've still got to do it. And a lot of memory clinics sit in little community centres, community hospitals. You've still got to have a room to take the blood. You've got to have somebody who can take blood. You've got to have a machine to spin down the blood afterwards and then a freezer to put it in before you send it off. Now, these sound simple things, but they all have a cost. And at the moment, where I do my memory clinic in Abingdon, we don't have any spare room for these things. You know, they're busy seeing patients. So, you know, it's not a small path. Anyway, again, as James highlighted, there has been lots of exciting news about our readout study. This is some of it, which I'm really pleased about. And we hope that this is adding to our knowledge about some of those questions. As we said already, this is a DPUK study that I co-lead with James and Ivan. And these are the questions that we are hoping it will address. So some of those validation questions. Are the blood tests good enough to use in real-world populations? What are the health economics? Do they add value to what we do already? and what's the impact if you get the results. We're also going to be looking, or we are looking, at whether these blood tests are good for diagnosis, but also prognosis. Are you likely to progress fast, or are you likely to progress more slowly? One thing that's unique about our study, we think, is that we are looking for blood tests in terms of, are they useful for Alzheimer's disease, but also diagnosing other types of dementia. And I won't go into it in detail, but we're using some of our existing DPUK data in order to validate the results. We've got a key emphasis on recruiting people of diverse ethnicities, the very elderly, and people who have other medical problems to try and answer these questions. And another key bit of our study is, how do we disclose these results? And finally, we've got some subtests that will look at the real world effects. So things like, if you have your tests done in different places or by different people, will you get a different result? If you leave your blood test, the blood sample on the side for a couple of hours, is that going to make a difference? And can we do these by post? Because again, if we could get the same results by collecting your blood at home, and we just send you a kit through the post and you send it back, that's even easier than coming for a blood test. So just to summarise, and I thought this was hopefully useful for people who are in readout here, but also the Great Minds participants. This is a 5-year project. We're really, really excited that we were selected to get funding for this. We have got a strong input from the public and a patient group into the design of this study, and we are running it at 28 of our sites across the country. And as I said, there's a real emphasis in the study about recruiting people who are from those groups I've already mentioned. The study has 2 phases. Our observational study started right at the end of last year, so on the 31st of December, and is currently running, and hopefully the results from that will establish a panel, so a group of blood biomarkers, which we think will be more effective than a single one. Once we've established the best panel of blood tests, that will feed into a trial to look at the effects of disclosure. And so that will include things like quality of life, but also some of the concerns we've mentioned, like, does it cause you to feel depressed? Does it cause you to feel anxious? But also, what does it do to whether you go to your doctor more? Do you go to your doctor more because you're anxious, because you've been told you've got higher levels of a test that's related to Alzheimer's? Or actually, do you feel reassured because you know and you have more information? And we're using some particular bits to try and get to those underrepresented groups, like research buses. We're working with some companies to look at how we can expand the analysis sites. And we've also got some bolt-on studies that will look at some really new biomarkers that are just being developed. What if we do genetics as well? And what if we add in things like digital cognitive tests? And just up-to-date news of where we're at. This is a graph that's really nice to show at the moment. The orange line is where we are with recruitment. So we've recruited just over 300 people to the study so far. The blue line is where we expected to be. So at the moment, you can see we're doing really, really well. And this is with just about 20 sites open, which are the blocks at the bottom. So it's going really well. I would say one of the challenges we're facing is, how do we access those groups that we don't traditionally get into trials? So we're working with our sites to ensure we do that as effectively as possible. But I think, what I would welcome from this group is if people have thoughts, people are interested, they want to get involved, want to support us with that, whether they want to take part in the study or actually just have some ideas of, how can we make sure we reach people who are very elderly? How can we make sure we reach some of those groups that we don't traditionally recruit? And it's not just ethnic diversity, it's socioeconomic diversity. People live in rural areas and those sorts of things. So we'd welcome your thoughts. So the vision at the end of all of this, and again, James talked about some of this, is that in the future, in a memory clinic, you're probably more likely to be given a prognosis of whether you will get dementia and what the rate of your progression could be, rather than a diagnosis. And ultimately, what this means is we could be going earlier, and we could be identifying people that are more at risk rather than have really frank memory problems. So we could be ultimately looking for people who have risk factors, maybe have subtle changes in their cognition rather than frank impairment, and a biomarker. So could we ultimately use information from all of these tests to develop some kind of score? And this is where things like AI could be useful. Having done that, we'd then think about tailoring treatment. So we try and help you with your risk factors that could be modified, enhanced protective factors, so some of the stuff that John highlighted, like reading and walking around city centres, and then possibly specific drug interventions. And then, if you do all of that, you need to know if it's working or not. And that's, again, where biomarkers could be really useful, because you may see your cognitive profile change, but it's probably going to be subtle. So we need a biomarker to see whether all of these interventions are helping. The other thing that's useful to think about is, if we go earlier and we detect more people at risk, or we accurately diagnose people, which probably, again, means we're going to see more and more people coming into memory clinics, how are we going to manage that? Because we all know the NHS is struggling to keep up as it is. As we said, we already have big waiting lists for clinics, and a lot of my clinical colleagues are very concerned about that. You know, how are we going to incorporate this? Because we're already struggling. One thing that some of the things like AI or the digital cognitive test could provide is a virtual clinic. So if you have a biomarker that's positive and we think you're likely to progress slowly, we give you some kind of treatment. We say, you've responded to that. So we don't need to see you in the memory clinic at the moment. We just need to keep an eye on you. And we'll do that through some kind of digital app on your phone or something like that. And then if the results of that are fed back to the clinic and kept track of, if we see a change, we bring you back in. So I could definitely see that being part of the pathway. And so this is what a personalised prevention plan could look like. So it could be that when you're 60s, your overall risk is calculated. So LS on this diagram means lifestyle stuff. So we'd look at your lifestyle, we'd look at your genetics, and we'd look at big risk factors like diabetes. And maybe for this person, their diabetes isn't very well controlled. So the main intervention at that point is, let's get your diabetes under better control. So they do that. They also lose weight and have dietary advice. And then 10 years later, they come back. And one of my colleagues said, this is because it's the NHS, you know, you're only going to be seen every 10 years. But you come back when you're 70, at that point, because of all the stuff that's gone before, your lifestyle factors and risks are smaller, genetic factors are the same, but your diabetes is better controlled, but your biological risk goes up because you're getting older. So at that point, your risk has shrunk, but that's when we start targeted drug therapy. So when you come back when you're 80, we've counteracted those biological risks. And overall, we have reduced your risk of getting dementia at that point. So this is where you can see it's complicated. There's lots of different things that we need to try and manage better, but it's feasible. And I think this is where services will be going. But just a bit of a reality check again, there was a survey done, this is in 2018, but I think the results are still very valid, that looked at whether healthcare systems in 6 European countries were actually ready to deliver the new drugs, so that the modifying drugs that we have 2 of approved now. So what they calculated is if the drugs were available in 2020, based on capacity the healthcare systems had, what's the first time that you wouldn't have a waiting list for the drugs? In Germany, it was 10 years. In France, it was 13 years. In the UK, it was 22 years before we got through the waiting list. And the main rate limiting step were the specialists, so having enough doctors and nurses, but also the delivery capacity. Now, this was based on IV drugs, which is the current drugs are given by intravenous infusion. There's a lot of obviously focus on developing drugs that are given by tablet, which would make it easier. But again, it just makes us think these are not going to be easy things, both in terms of treatments and the biomarkers to implement at scale. But the reality is that if you look back at a paper that was published by one of my colleagues, Craig Ritchie, back in 2017, called the Edinburgh Consensus, it was saying we need to be getting ready for these drugs. The biomarkers are coming, the drugs are coming. And yet, despite all this, I still do the same thing in my memory clinic as I did in 1994. I do the same tests, I ask the same questions, I have the same access to scans. And yet there's been all this change and a lot happening. And I think it will change, but I guess I'm just emphasising the fact that there's a lot to change. One way I just wanted to highlight in the last minute or two of how we're trying to change that, because we recognise that the health system is under a lot of pressure and we can't boil the ocean, we can't change it overnight, much though we would like to. So a lot of my colleagues have set up these things called brain health clinics. Most of these are just set up using research money, so they're not coming from the central NHS pot, but they're looking at things like risk profiling, identifying risk and managing that, using biomarkers and preparing services so that they could deliver these drugs more effectively. And you can see the range of brain health clinics that exist at the moment across the UK. And these have been really supported by the charities like ARUK and Alzheimer's Society. And I'm part of one of the clinics in Oxford, which kicked off in 2020. And what this does is take people out of the memory clinic system at the point that they're referred, at the point they've had their brain scan. So in Oxford, people are referred by their GP to the memory clinic, they get sent off for a brain scan, and we channel them out the system, and then they go back into the memory clinic system for a diagnosis. And for some reason, my slides are stuck. There we go. What this means is that people coming to the Brain Health Clinic get a combination of traditional NHS assessments and research assessments. It's all put together in one report that goes to the clinic. And then when you come for your diagnostic appointment, it means that can be reduced in time. So an appointment that would take an hour and a quarter is down to 45 minutes, which the trusts love because they've already saved money, because it's less consultant time. And again, it's all of these things we need to think about as to whether it's scalable, because again, there's not endless money in the system. We have to think how to deliver this efficiently. And what we found since 2020 is we get really good feedback. A lot of patients don't mind coming and doing these extra assessments, including biomarkers, and some staff that were a bit skeptical about whether people could tolerate doing more tests have said, actually, I'm really surprised that people can manage these okay. And this really complicated slide just emphasizes that most people are happy to do this extra stuff. And there's two things I'd just like you to be aware of. So first of all, we ask people to consent to do the extra tests, and can we use their data? And as you can see, the numbers of people consenting in those green lines on the bottom left are really high. So very few people say no. The other thing that's a really nice figure is on the top right. It shows the breadth of ages that we've seen in the clinic. And I will draw your eye to the very right-hand side. The oldest person that we've had come through was 101. And she managed to do the MRI scan and all the assessments. And again, this is important because we don't want to exclude people just because you're maybe a wee bit more frail or you're going to struggle to get into the scanner. So this is nice data. It shows people are willing to do these extra tests. They want to do the tests and they can do the tests. And the nice thing again is this is a very representative sample. So again, we're not pulling research participants, we're just using real people and showing this works. This slide is a bit busy. I'm not again expecting you to read all of this, but it comes back to the point I made at the start, which is blood biomarkers are definitely an opportunity here, but when are we going to use them? And that's the bit we still need to sort out. Hopefully studies like Readout will help. So again, do we start off using them in memory clinics? I think that's probably most likely. Will they end up moving into primary care? So you have them done by your GP, or as I said, maybe you go and get a test and you take it to your GP. Or are we going to use them for screening? And I think that's still a way off, but we may get there. So just to finish off, I think today has really emphasized that we're at exciting times. There are new treatments. We can manage risks better. We know what risks we need to manage, and all of these innovations are here, and all of these mean we are a real exciting time in terms of being able to delay and prevent dementia. And blood biomarkers are a real opportunity because they're very accessible. Everyone can have a blood test pretty much. They're scalable. They can increase accuracy of diagnosis for better outcomes. And maybe if we combine them with other tests, we can use AI to detect people even more accurately and earlier. But there are challenges. Technical challenges with the tests, interpretation, and whether they add value. And the one thing I would just finish with is, personally, I think when I've been in meetings about, well, should we do this? Should we do this now? Or do we need to work out whether we can afford it and what else we need to do in the NHS, which is all very valid. I've always said, I think we need to go back to the public and ask you, what do you want? When would you want to have a blood test? And some of the questions that were raised at the beginning, would you want to know your risk earlier? What would you need to support you with that decision? And I think we need a big public voice. And personally, I think we need a bigger public conversation about how our services need to change because they're for you. you know, I don't think I should be telling you what to prioritize. I can advise you, but it's a public decision. So I would encourage you to talk to yourselves, talk to your MPs. You know, it was raised earlier about the conferences, get involved with the charities. They're doing a lot of this work in terms of survey work, and let's open the discussion. So thank you.
A question, or multiple questions online asking the same thing. What are these biomarkers? What are they testing? Is it tau? Is it amyloid? Is it genetics? So a little bit more information on what they are.
Yeah, and I mean, all of the above, really. I mean, the exciting thing is that in the last few years, there's been a lot of really good data about how accurate a range of biomarkers are. So the one that looks most accurate is a test called p-tau217, looks really accurate for Alzheimer's disease. Now, even though there's tau in the name, what it principally measures actually is amyloid. So that's the one that looks most exciting, it's most accurate. But as James highlighted, it's still not, although it is starting to be used in NHS clinics and it's certainly available privately. And if you said to me, which test should I get? If I get a biomarker test, that's the one. But as James highlighted, there's still some caveats in terms of how you interpret it. You don't always get a clear black and white result. So I agree with James, you really need support if you want that done. But there are other tests that look at things like general neurodegeneration, so general change in the brain, reflective of a disease. Obviously, we have genetic tests, and as Ivan highlighted, the one that's most linked with Alzheimer's disease in later life is ApoE4, but again, it's a risk gene. It's not, doesn't mean if you have it, you're going to get Alzheimer's. So there are a range of blood biomarkers that look at general degeneration in the brain, that look at amyloid, that look at tau, that look at other proteins related to things like Lewy body dementia and so on. So there's a lot of them. And then on top, we have what we call imaging biomarkers, so changes we see on certain types of scans. So it's really all of the above. And the question is, which of those are good enough to help with diagnosis now?
Thank you very much. There have been some fascinating developments in biomarkers, and I just wondered whether there have been any parallel improvements in clinical cognitive instruments. I mean, the Cantab battery has been around for decades. Are there improvements in this area as well?
Yeah, as I said, I think what everyone's wanting to look for now is what's the simplest and most scalable test that we can use widely that's going to be accurate enough. So the digital cognitive tests are definitely where everybody's focusing now. The idea that it's a quick and simple test you can either do on a phone or you can do on a laptop. And that's where there's the most development. So there are certainly some better tests. And in readout, we, as I kind of alluded to, we're going to try out 2 of those. I have to be honest, I mean, there's a lot of development in that area. And I think that's where everyone's going, that probably the combination of a blood test and a brief digital cognitive test is what we're going to want to use in the future. But when we took this concept to our patient and public group for readout, and we said, we're going to test these 2 tests. One is a thing you do on a computer and one is on a phone. And for people who don't have a phone, they'll be given a smartphone. One lady said very categorically, I'm apped out. I don't want another app on my phone. Thank you. I'm tired of filling in things on my phone. So I think that's where it's going, but we've got to be mindful that not everybody wants or can use technology. But yeah, that's where we're going.
Thank you. Maybe if we move to panel discussion, John, if you're happy to come up to the front as well. Is there a WD-40 that could help unstick the amyloid gluing up? I don't know whether James wants to take that one.
The short answer is yes. So you remember that big target I had with lots and lots of dots, lots and lots of drugs coming through. Some of those were about trying to clear this junk protein, clear the amyloid out, but others were about trying to stop it getting sticky and clumping together in the first place. And also for the tau molecules that fall off their normal scaffolding structures and start to clump up. So I like the idea of WD-40. I'm going to use that in my next talk, but it's absolutely right. So there are some that are sort of, in ambition, trying to stop these proteins becoming sticky. Often they become sticky because extra molecules get either taken off or added on, and it changes the stickiness. And there's a lot of drugs trying to target that. We don't know if they work yet, but that's the ambition.
Anything to add? Or?
No, I think we will be asking the company of WD-40 whether they'd be interested in sponsoring some of this, I think.
Yeah.
Okay. A few questions about participating in... Oh, sorry. Yes, go in the room. Yeah.
Talking about WD-40. Talking about WD-40, I'm partially involved with something at the moment called the Neural Wave from a doctor in the States. I don't necessarily follow him or believe him, but he has got me listening to music for about 17 minutes if I want to every night. And a lot of this goes back to mindfulness, which I'd heard about 15, 20 years ago. But that is supposedly something else that would clear whatever's going on in your brain. I don't know if you've heard of that, Neural Wave from Mike Johnson, I think his name is, or whether there's any possibility in that being helpful.
Oh, yeah, of course, I have a mic. I've forgotten I have a mic. That's hopefully non-serious memory impairment. I don't know, James may have a comment as well. I think mindfulness is obviously a good way of relaxing. We're all very busy. Life is very frantic. We don't often turn off. We all need to be doing that more. So I think in terms of those wider risk factors of memory impairment progressing, depression was in there, so I think mindfulness can help depression. Mindfulness can help anxiety. And in that way, absolutely, it could slow the likelihood of your memory disorder, if you have one, progressing. The other thing is that we know things like stress, chronic stress, and the hormones involved in that do play a part, again, in whether if you have underlying Alzheimer's disease in midlife, it possibly going down that trajectory to dementia. Will it clear your amyloid? I don't think so.
That's what I was querying, because he talked about like street cleaners going through and clearing out the problems. He didn't use the word amyloid, but that's what he was indicating, I think.
I think certainly maybe clearing out all of the problems that we, probably worry too much about, absolutely. But again, it's maybe reducing just one of those risk factors that all have to come together in order for for any memory problems to get worse. So I don't think it's absolutely a bad thing to do. I think it's a good thing to do. But again, it may not be the whole WD-40.
James, please.
What if I comment as well? There's a couple of thoughts here. So one is it's hard to imagine it being high risk. It's hard to imagine any safety concerns with listening to music. First threshold, tick, that's good. Might it help our brain health and well-being? Very plausibly, whether it's through mindfulness or relaxation or helping you get better into sleep. Great, tick. My concern comes when it comes to people making claims about mechanism and pseudoscience. And here we have to know that if you were to try and promote a drug as being effective, it has to go through a very rigorous and very strictly legal process about backing up the claims. It's well beyond what Advertising Standards Authority would ever impose, and there's a very strict legal framework. And if you step outside that, the MHRA or equivalent can take you to court and go to jail. When it comes to other things like music, nutritional supplements, diet, there are no such rules. You can make outrageous and unsubstantiated claims, and there is no legal framework to say that's not right. You're selling a treatment on false premises. So I'm not saying that's particular to this particular claim, but I hear a lot of claims about different treatments and nutritions or exercises, various lifestyle changes, which have no supporting evidence. But there's no mechanism to regulate that and say, hang on, guys, you cannot say that. It's just not true. We can do that for drugs. We have to do that for drugs. There's a mechanism to say that's not true. You must not say it. For other snake oils, there's no mechanism to say that's illegal. It's snake oil. So we have to be very careful. If it's safe and it's cheap, I let it pass. But I would add a note of caution. If it's unsafe and it's not cheap, I would avoid these things. If it's too good to be true, it probably isn't.
Thank you, James.
Can I just
Please.
add something to that? It's all very metaphors are lovely, aren't they? street cleaners and that. Fantastic. But sometimes you need a bit of a more precise metaphor. The one that I find helpful is thinking of the brain in terms of having a hardware component and a software component. And there may be many things that you can do, like relaxing, listening to music, which might help the software work more efficiently, but it won't have any effect on the hardware. Now, when we're talking about a mechanism affecting drugs, we're talking about hardware, that you are changing the mechanism of the brain, not necessarily the efficiency of which the brain works, which might be a software problem. Now, they may be related, but they're actually very different. I completely agree with everything that Vanessa and James has said.
Just to change the tack slightly, we've got a few questions about volunteering. Can we volunteer, or do we have to be invited to participate? John, do you want to respond to that?
Well, I think anyone can volunteer. Or I think we should all very seriously consider volunteering. It is for the public good and for future generational benefit. There is no way around it. We all receive enormous benefit from the NHS. We live in the good of our lives now because of people who've volunteered in the past for health-related research. I can only encourage anybody who ever listens to this to volunteer. And for those who do volunteer, we are extremely grateful.
And so I was going to just to lead on to that. Somebody said, how can I volunteer for the readout study? So there we go.
And that's what I was going to say. There is, so on the Dementias Platform UK website, if you go on to that, there is a link for the readout study. You can sign up whether you have a memory problem or not. So although readout is for people who have memory problems, if you don't, it also takes you through another route where you can register your interest. So if you haven't signed up for that, and you're not signed up for Great Minds, or you want to look at readout, please go there and we'd be very grateful.
Thank you. And an interesting one, what would you say is the role of a caregiver in mitigating risk to the patient with blood biomarkers?
I think that's a very interesting question. I mean, again, I think as James highlighted, you do really need to understand why is somebody wanting to have that test. Is it because they are worried about their risks? Maybe they've got a family history, maybe there's something in their personal history like a head injury that they're concerned about. And then I think I would say you therefore need to be able to work out with them how likely is this to be useful. So if you've had one parent, say, who developed dementia in their 90s, that risk of a family history is going to be much less. If you've had several family members, and maybe at a younger age, particularly under 60, as Ivan mentioned, that's a much higher risk scenario. Or you've been a rugby player, and you've had a lot of head injuries. Again, we know that's an increasing area of concern. I think it's about supporting the person to think about their risks if they haven't already had a diagnosis, and then helping them decide, do I need to go to my GP? Do I need to speak to them? Do I need to go to a memory clinic? If I'm already under a memory clinic, do I need to ask to speak to one of the doctors again? And that has happened in my clinic where some people have gone and had a blood test done, usually as part of another study, and then they've asked to come back to the clinic because of the result. They want a review of their diagnosis, and then I think that's absolutely appropriate. So it's about supporting the person with thinking, okay, you'd like to get the test, but why do you want it? And what are we going to do with it?
I've been volunteering for the last 15 years in various research programs. I've always gone through all the paperwork, signing away my data, ticking boxes without any concerns at all, in the understanding that what I was doing was contributing to people's health, saving lives, etc. But in the last couple of years, Big Pharma has been getting a very bad name for itself, and it's become clear that the information that I'm giving up has actually got a commercial value, and it's giving me doubts that I never used to have when I started getting involved in medical research. And I wonder what you would say about this commercial value of the information, the big data that we're giving up for free?
Yes. So I think there are two issues here. One is the security of your identity, your personal privacy. And DPUK works really hard on that, which is why if you take part in one of the DPUK studies, I might see a row of data, but I don't know, and I cannot find out who belongs to that row of data, or who, you get my meaning, right? I just do not know. I don't wish to know. And if I think I do know, I have to report myself to information governance. So that's the first thing. It's really secure. The second thing is that researchers are really not good at turning results into products. And what we benefit from is products. So the issue isn't really how we relate to big pharma. The issue is what is an equitable relationship with big pharma. And I think there are different models for that, and they're not fully worked out. So, for example, if you charge pharma a prohibitive amount of money to access data, okay, that's great in the short term, but in the long term, they might get fed up and not access the data. If you don't charge anything to access data, then the research platform, etc., doesn't benefit from it. And if you like, there's very little public return. My personal view is that this is a discussion to be had. It's a social contract we need to establish with pharma. But what is not helpful is to say that relating to pharma is a bad idea. All right, because we need the drugs, the products, and they are expensive and they take. It's a big risk for a company to try and develop a dementia drug, and therefore we do need to have a very positive relationship with them. And DPUK has worked hard at this, and I think we have a very equitable model. So I'm very comfortable in our relationship with pharma, but I agree not everybody may have thought this through to the same extent.
And if I could just add one point to that, I think because, as you said, if you go back a few years, there wasn't such a large set of data available from any of these research studies, so we didn't think about this. Now we do. So when you sign your consent form now to go in a study, it does explicitly say where that data will be shared. Will it be available to commercial companies? What would that relationship look like? So I think if you went back 10, 20 years ago, it would be much vaguer, ultimately, how that data could be used. Now, it should be very clear in your consent form. So I think we are also getting better at making sure you know where your data should go and where it shouldn't. And those types of agreements now and the ethics that we have to get agreed when we do the consent forms are much, much tighter, and they should be. So if you're not sure and you're concerned, I know it may be tricky, but if you go back to the research team, they should be able to tell you, legally and ethically, they should tell you where your data's gone, and if you're concerned about it being sold, ask them.
Thank you. James, we've got one question on the biomarkers. Are they specific to Alzheimer's that we've been talking about, or how are the biomarkers for other dementias? I don't know whether you want to comment on that.
Yeah, no. So the current generation of biomarkers, those that are coming into use this year and next year, really only pick up Alzheimer's disease, not the other 30-40% of dementias. There are many other types of dementias. At the moment, we only have Alzheimer biomarkers. There's a lot of work, and in fact, part of the readout study that Vanessa talked about is to try and do better about biomarkers that can be positively identifying the other types of dementia. We don't have that yet, not from blood. We do from scans and PET scans and spinal fluid tests and so on, but just not from blood. And it would be really a great breakthrough to be able to be more positive. It might not be Alzheimer's, but it is definitely something else, and vice versa. It's a work in progress.
The blood test that is currently being used or being developed as for biomarkers if I go to have my blood sugar levels checked from an HB1, it seems to be a relatively simple process, provided that the blood test is taken by a certain time during the day. It can get to the lab and we get a result back in a day or 2 days. Is the biomarker test more complicated? Do we have to have another process in place? Is there a whole new infrastructure to be developed to make sure that the sample arrives in pure form and that the lab technician is suitably qualified to deal with it, and then the result is interpreted properly?
I mean, James may comment on this as well, but I would just say no is the simple answer. You know, the blood tests are very much, particularly the front runners we have now that seem good for Alzheimer's disease. They are simple blood tests that don't require a lot of processing. I think I mentioned you have to kind of spin the blood down, but there's nothing vastly special about the ones that seem to be really good at the moment. Now, it may be when we're looking at other blood tests that we may need to do some other techniques in terms of that processing. But at the moment, I think we're aiming for something that can be that easy to deliver. And as I said, ultimately, what would be even better is something that can be done just with a blood spot. And there is good data, starting to be good data around that too, or a remote blood collecting device. Because otherwise, you know, again, it loses that benefit of being something really easy. But again, the other thing I would say, as I mentioned, is it's also how you standardize the kit that analyzes the blood. So the blood test may be straightforward, but as you said, if you went back a few years, some of the ways that these blood tests were analysed required more specialist experience. Now we've got kit where it's much more straightforward, but they still have to be standardised. But I think, James, it would be fair to say that we're moving towards these things being as simple and replicatable as possible.
Exactly. And the reason it seems simple when you have your blood sugar test, the diabetes test, is because people have worked on this for 40 years. We weren't aware of it, but actually behind the scenes, it's taken years to make the test easy, reliable, robust, you know, proof against the weather, proof against postal delays. Every hospital, even some GP surgeries can do it. That wasn't by chance. It took a lot of work, and now it seems so simple. And that's where we want to be for the dementia ones as well.
Okay, I'd just like to add a comment to that in terms of the cognitive biomarkers. The blood biomarkers are relatively straightforward because you've got 40 years of development so that the system is understood and the uncertainties are largely removed. With cognitive tests, they are not that mature. So you have lots of cognitive tests, but the quality of the evidence supporting the claims is often questionable. And what we need to do, and Dementias Platform UK is trying to do this, and we will do it as a part of our renewal, is to get the cognitive biomarker community to establish what the standards should be, and therefore you could give a kite mark equivalent to the good cognitive test, and you could withhold the kite mark equivalent to what I might disparagingly call the cowboy test. Okay, this is really, really important, but it's something which we haven't, as a research community, we haven't yet tackled adequately.
I have another question or observation, which is political. I'm a migrant to the country, and a few years ago I did the Knowledge of the UK test and then became a citizen here in Oxford. I think there must be quite a few of us around who are migrants. And when I think about what the government is asking at present about, say, A-level English, I don't think the English needs to be at that level, and I don't know what markers they would take. Is it knowledge of Shakespeare plays, or just an ability to converse in English and have an argument? But I think somehow we need to call the government to count, and make sure they don't put into practice or law things that are going to do the country a disservice. I'm interested in the level of English that I see in the care home where my wife is and in the 2 hospital wards at the John Radcliffe she was in. That does concern me, and there need to be certain rules about how the language is used in hospitals. But let's call the government to account and halt them in any initiatives they might think they've got.
If I could just respond to that very briefly. I think there's a big difference between conference rhetoric and what's real. And I am very confident I would fail the A-level test.
Yes, I was going to say the same thing, but I think you've highlighted a point, which is all of these new developments mean there is much more focus on dementia, the causes of dementia, and we are getting so close to the idea that we could make a real difference to these diseases, which is amazing. But it highlights the fact that this is part of a much bigger picture, again, that Ivan alluded to. Just because you're diagnosed with dementia doesn't mean you get discharged from hospital to the care you need. It doesn't mean that it's an easy system to navigate. I would say it's even got more and more complicated over the last 10 years and more lacking, sadly. So this is going to demand a lot of thought so we get the system right. Just because you diagnose somebody and you give them a drug is just the start. So I think this is about the government having a coherent plan for care beyond the board, because there will still be people who will develop dementia. There will still be people who need a range of support. We have to get that right too. But the good thing is all of this is shining a light on that need now, and hopefully we can get it right. We need the government to get it right.
James, did you have something to say?
I might say, well, I think whether we're a patient or a carer or just helping a friend navigate health service, we all want to be able to communicate with the professionals we deal with. But it's also worth remembering that our health service, and like our schools, could not operate were it not for the enormous number of dedicated doctors and nurses who were not born in the UK, maybe trained abroad and moved here later. We simply couldn't have anywhere near the level of healthcare were it not for people who've come to the UK to live and work. And it's finding that right balance that we can also make sure we can communicate. I think just keeping this an open debate, reminding people how important it is that we have people that move around the world, bringing energy and talent and help.
Thank you. And Ivan, final comment?
I think it's been probably one of my favorite events so far in this series, and we've had a stiff competition on that one. So with that, I'd like to thank you for coming. I'd like to thank everyone who chose to spend the afternoon with us. I'd like to thank our wonderful speakers. Thank you for joining from Cambridge, even if it's second best in the competition between the two cities. But thanks to John, thanks to Vanessa, and thanks for Simon and to the rest of the team for putting it all together, because we come here to give the talks, but there's a lot of work that goes behind the scenes. So I'm grateful for those. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon.